The following compilation features unsettling and spine-chilling tales sourced from Reddit's horror communities. Reader discretion is strongly advised. These narratives may contain graphic descriptions, psychological distress, and themes that could unsettle sensitive individuals. Proceed with caution, as immersion into these eerie stories may provoke fear, unease, and sleep disturbances. Enter this realm of Reddit's creepy horror stories at your own risk, as the line between reality and the macabre may blur within these chilling narratives. Story 1. Down by the water. And now the storm has left the beach deserted, and the ocean crashes and roars against the surf. I am alone and covered with blood. Standing on the slowly retreating waterline, I watch for the first signs of sunrise. I'm waiting. I've been waiting so long. But Ophelia said she'd be here. She promised. It had taken 4 hours of driving to reach Cape Cod. It was me, my mother and father, and my brother Leon, who was a year and a half older than me, the darling daughter. Ordinarily, my father celebrated his son's victories with men-only trips to New York City or Lake George. But since his beloved all-star was heading off to college in the fall, he decided it would be a family affair. No matter how much I'd tried to weasel out of it, Father still made me go. It wasn't because they were worried about me getting into some kind of trouble. It was simply an unspoken rule in the Sweet family that I never got what I wanted. An hour into the trip, Leon started ragging on me, making snide remarks about my grades, my waistline, and my therapist. Then waving his scholarship under my nose, I ignored it for as long as I could. But my Walkman's batteries died as we passed through Sturbridge, Massachusetts, so I decided that would be the perfect time to bring up his DUI. All hell broke loose in the car. It got so bad that we had to pull over so my father could tell me in no uncertain terms that I was 17 and I needed to grow up and get my head on straight. As always, Mother tried to be the peacemaker and failed miserably. The rest of the car ride was icily quiet, except for the music on the radio. But Father started to perk up as he got closer to the cabin. He was so proud of the deal he'd gotten. We turned left on a street called Patty Page Way onto a long dirt driveway. Once we reached the cabin, we understood it hadn't been a deal at all. It had been a robbery. The outside of the cabin was a wreck, with peeling paint, a sagging porch, and a crooked hanging bench. Tiles were missing from the red roof, and the windows were cracked and covered in grime. It looked like it should have been condemned, not rented out. My mother and I said we should double back and find a hotel. But my father, of course, would have none of it. It's already paid for. Non-refundable. You're not even giving it a chance. Let's look inside. The inside of the cabin wasn't nearly as bad, but it was obvious it hadn't been cleaned in a while. There was a layer of dust on the worn-out furniture, and cobwebs adorned the corners of the room. My mother went to the bedrooms to check for bed bugs or worse, and returned with a nod of reluctant approval. "See," my father said, "it's not so bad. And besides, after you girls clean it up a little." "Us girls?" I dropped my bags on the floor. I thought this was a family vacation. Leon rolled his eyes, and my father looked ready to turn purple. Mother tried to get in the middle. What she meant was that we didn't come all this way, just... Oh, I know what she meant, all right. My father looked right over Mother and glared at me. I could feel the "I work all day" speech coming. He said, "I work all day so you and your goddamn mother can have nice things, and all you give me is grief." "It's not fair," I said. "Honey, maybe if we work together," Mother began, but she stopped talking when my father's glare turned her way. With that, Leon and my father announced they were going to the store to get pizza and beer. But of course, my father couldn't leave without one last barb at me. Besides, a little work might help you slim down a little. Leon laughed. "You hear that, Chubbs?" Face contorted with rage, I stormed out of that rat-hole cabin, shouting, "That's not my name." If anyone called out after me, I didn't hear. I ran to the beach, determined not to let them see me cry. I'd never seen the ocean, except for movies and TV. It was huge, stretching across the horizon. Looking at it made me feel small, but I didn't mind. My science teacher had told me that the oceans were the first things the Earth created. They would probably be the last things to go. There were big, ugly seagulls everywhere and tiny, nervous-looking birds that divided most of their time between sifting in the mud and running in terror at the slightest motion. Small shells cracked under my feet. Slipping off my shoes, I waded into the surf, feeling the waves brushing against and around my legs. As I waded through the water, I saw my reflection. For as long as I can remember, I've despised what I saw staring back at me. My weight, the constant burden I carried, distorted my image, making me appear older than my years. I had battled with it for as long as I could remember, dieting on and off since I was 8 years old, yet nothing seemed to make a difference. 2 years ago, someone mistook me for Leon's mother, and that was the moment I mostly gave up trying to change. Still, despite my aversion, I could not look away as I watched how the ripples in the water pulled me apart and pieced me back together again. It was like I was hypnotized. I walked along the water's edge, not glancing up until distant voices startled me. That's when I realized it was twilight, and the ocean had turned a bruised purple color. When I got back to the cabin, I found my mother nearly in tears. "Where were you? We were worried sick. We almost called the police." "I'm sorry," I said. Leon and my father were sitting at the rickety table, a plate of chicken bones in front of each of them. My father stood up and approached me. His breath was sour, and there were shreds of chicken in his teeth. "Are you trying to ruin this vacation?" "Look, you're miserable and ungrateful, and I won't stand for it." He poked me in the chest, just hard enough to hurt, but not hard enough to leave a mark. "You are gonna shape up and fly, right? Do you hear me?" Leon rolled his eyes. "Oh, like she'll ever get in shape." Mother hushed him, but let my father continue his performance. He said, "I didn't bring you up here so you could screw around and do whatever you want to do. We are here to vacation as a family." The word stung my mouth. "I'm sorry." He smiled with satisfaction and gestured to the table. I didn't like the looks of the pizza place, so we got some Kentucky Fried Chicken. "I got you a large meal." He turned to go outside and have a smoke. Leon tagged along after him. Mother busied herself cleaning up while I ate all the food my father had brought, hating myself with every bite. Despite being warned we were going on a deep-sea fishing trip, no one was ready for my father shouting and bullying us all awake more than an hour before sunrise. My mother was barely awake, but he was already ordering her and me to make breakfast. I didn't mind helping, but I did mind that Leon didn't have to lift a finger. One sloppily made breakfast later, we were in the car making our way to the marina. Leon was in the front seat, listening to my father's stories about the deep-sea fishing expeditions he had gone on as a single man in the Navy. My mother's gaze shifted down to her lap when he said those had been the best days of his life. Leon asked about the ship, and my father began to explain the difference between a regular yacht and a sport fishing yacht, but suddenly I realized something. "Dad, we have to go back," I said. "I forgot my jacket." "So?" he said. "You said it would be freezing." And I said not to forget anything. He shrugged. He actually picked up speed as he maneuvered the car onto the interstate. 10 years ago, he'd told me I was his princess and he would do anything for me. My mother piped up. "It's not such a bother, is it? We don't want her to catch cold." "No, that's all right." She patted my arm. "We'll just buy you a jacket when we get to the marina. They must have a gift shop around there." "We are not buying her a goddamn thing," my father said. "Good thing she's got all that blubber to protect her," Leon said in a stage whisper. "Ginny, let me handle this," my father said. Maybe she wouldn't be such a brat if she had to deal with some consequences once in a while. "Oh," I said, "like your son had to deal with his consequences. How much did you spend to keep him out of jail?" The answer was a lot. My father had moved heaven and earth to protect Leon and his promising future. It had hurt our family financially and socially, and he had forbidden any of us to talk about it. But at moments like this, I was glad to bring it up. It felt good to remind them that the boy wonder had feet of clay. God damn it. He pounded his fist on the steering wheel. Can you not be a bitch for 5 minutes? I don't know. My reply was lightning fast. So fast that I didn't realize the words had come from my mouth. Can you not be a bastard? The brakes squealed as my father swerved us onto the shoulder. My mother gasped, and my brother snickered. A line had been crossed, but so many lines had been crossed over the last few years, I barely cared anymore. All I could think to myself was how we used to be a family. What happened to us? He unbuckled himself and turned around in his seat. You think you can talk to me like that? All this over a damn coat? Yes, I said. Over a coat? That's it, he said, and I flinched instinctively. You're grounded. Grounded? We sped back to the cabin, and with every twist and turn of the wheel, my mother and brother grew more and more worried that my father was going to send us plowing into a tree or a ditch. Finally, we arrived back at the cabin, and my father slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a screeching halt. Without a word, he shifted into park and turned off the engine. We all sat there in silence, waiting for his next move. My father turned to face me. Get out. He pointed towards the cabin's front door. Go to your room and stay there until we get back. I started to speak, but my mother shushed me. Just do what he says. Please don't make any more trouble. We're going to be late, Leon said. I sighed and stepped out of the car onto the dusty gravel driveway. My family drove away. They left me behind. The sound of their departure echoed in my ears. I trudged up to the front door, wondering if any of them had spared me a backward glance. When I was alone in the cabin, I did not go straight to my room. I plopped down on the couch. I had been looking forward to today. I had been so excited at the thought of being out on the ocean, so far out on the ocean, that the shore would be just a memory. I had been so excited that I had forgotten my jacket. Now I could see it across the room, slung over the arm of the recliner. The sight of it made me bury my face in my hands. I stayed that way for a long time. Then I went to my temporary bedroom like a good girl and hated myself for it. With nothing else to do, I napped and listened to my Walkman going through every one of the Police's albums, from Outlandos d'Amour to Synchronicity. It was just a little while after lunch when the calls began. I answered immediately, thinking it was my parents checking up on me somehow. Hello? I heard a man's voice ask. Is she there? He was weeping. Who is this? I asked. Who is this? I think you have the wrong number, I said. Ophelia, is it you? I hung up the phone with a grimace, imagining some idiot with a fake number from a bimbo who'd flashed them a polite smile at first, or some fake affection at best. Better them than me. I started to go back to my room when the phone rang again. I waited for whoever was on the other line to give up. 10 rings later, I answered. Hello? Ophelia? They blubbered. That's not my name. I said, please stop calling. You sound like her. I'm not her. I'm nobody. The voice became even more desperate and pleading. I've waited for so long. I put the receiver back down again. They called back almost instantly. This time I let the phone ring, put on my Walkman, and cranked the volume all the way up. I tried to let the music transport me to a place far away from the cabin, from that phone call, from my family. Message in a bottle filled my ears, and I imagined myself somewhere far, far away. But the ringing persisted. I heard it going on and on in the silence between one song and another. It made me feel uneasy with questions. Finally, inevitably, I ripped off the earphones and picked up the phone again. Look, I told you already. You have the wrong number, I said. I did everything you asked. The voice on the other end of the line trembled. I've been waiting for so long. Please, I pleaded. Stop bothering me. I need to see you. He said, "I'm coming to see you now. You don't even know." 328 Patty Page Way. The stranger started weeping again. "Don't you remember? We walked from the cabin to the beach and held hands at the promontory." My stomach dropped. I quickly ended the call and retreated back to my room. After a few panicked moments, I put the chair in front of the door. How did they know where I was? I envisioned a local Romeo bewitched by a visiting Juliet. Now Juliet was long gone and Romeo was heartbroken. And where did that leave me? Alone and defenseless with my family miles away. I hated myself for arguing over a stupid jacket. Was it really worth it? Arguing with people who would never let me win? Why couldn't I just grin and bear it? The hours dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. I was terrified and bored. I didn't dare put my headphones back on, so I listened. Every creak and groan of the cabin seemed to taunt me. My nerves were shot as I waited for something, anything, to happen. Was the caller all talk and no action? Or would some maniac break down the front door in search of his lost Ophelia? A dozen forevers later, I heard the family car pulling up outside. Relief made me feel weak, but I still managed to unbarricade myself from my room and meet them at the door. My family looked sunburnt and exhausted. When I hugged my father, he reeked of salt and sweat. But I didn't care one damn bit. Looks like someone learned their lesson. There was a long pause before he reluctantly hugged me back. My mother entered the cabin holding up the bag of fast food she had gotten for me. When my brother passed my field of vision, he gave me a smirk. I didn't care. I didn't argue. I just didn't want to be alone and afraid anymore. That night, as I scarfed down my burger, I told them about the creep on the phone. My mother was horrified and said I should have called the police. My brother rolled his eyes and said I should have just left the phone off the receiver. And my father told me next time I should grab a steak knife before I went into hiding. That night, I couldn't sleep well. The sound of the ocean was louder than usual, making me feel restless. The next morning, my mother said she wanted us all to go to the beach as a family. My father agreed with a grunt. Leon asked if he could call his friends from a few days ago and have them meet us there. My parents were fine with that. As soon as my brother was off the phone, we grabbed our cooler, beach chairs, and towels. We walked the short distance to the shore. The ocean was just as beautiful before. Sunlight danced upon the waves, creating a breathtaking display of shimmering light. I wanted to stare, but instead helped my family find a spot and set up our little beach camp. My brother Leon, ignoring our mother's protests that we had just arrived, went off in search of his friends. I told my parents I wanted to go for a swim, and my father told me to be careful. My mother looked me over and asked why I wasn't wearing the nice new bathing suit she had gotten for me. I didn't really want to go into the water in shorts and a t-shirt, did I? I explained that I was wearing the pale pink one-piece bathing suit she had bought me under my t-shirt and shorts. That led to an argument that was as gentle as it was relentless. My mother won out, and I stripped out of my shorts and t-shirt. My father scowled at me and looked away. The salty breeze whipped at my hair, and as I waded into the cold water, slowly, I let myself sink into the sea, allowing my body to float on its surface. The vastness of the ocean made my insecurity and anger seem insignificant. Looking back to the beach, I saw Leon returning with a small group of new friends, 2 girls and 2 guys. They introduced themselves to my parents, then they stripped out of their street clothes, revealing bathing suits beneath. One of the girls wore a swimsuit exactly like the one from the Christie Brinkley poster. My father did not look away from her. An incoming wave lifted me up and dropped me back down again. When I looked back, they were running into the surf, laughing and splashing each other. There was no way I wanted to share my part of the ocean with them, so I picked a direction and started to swim, my limbs moving with practiced ease. I had always been a good swimmer, but everything changed when I turned 12 and started to gain weight. Despite being an athletic kid, I began overeating in 7th grade. Our house had always been full of snacks, but suddenly, I couldn't keep my hands off them. I don't know what changed, but everyone else seemed to have an opinion about it, and each one was worse than the last. Mindful of the riptides, I kept the beach to my left as I swam. I saw volleyball players, solitary people reading, women sunbathing, children playing. Strangers, all of them, but I knew if they saw me, they would snicker and make snide remarks. After a while, longer than I expected, my muscles began to ache, and fatigue set in. It was time to return to land and rest. Maybe I would walk back, or maybe just sit on the sand for a while. In the distance, I noticed a formation of rocks jutting out from the water's surface. It was wide enough for 3 people to walk along and stretched all the way back to the beach. As I swam closer, I saw it rose about 5 feet above the waves. The closer I got, the rougher the ocean became, pushing me towards the rocks. I struggled to maintain control, but the relentless waves made keeping my head above water difficult. Salt water filled my mouth, and I collided with the ugly crag with bruising force. I floated there for a few minutes, clinging to the rock formation, finding a sturdy handhold. I began to climb, my tired muscles groaning with effort. Finally, I pushed myself up and lay flat on my back, staring at the sky and the gulls. I concentrated on nothing more than catching my breath. What would have happened if I had drowned? If the angry tide had smashed me against the rocks with fatal force? Would my family even care? Or would they be relieved? Would they make jokes as they searched for a plus-size coffin? I shut my eyes tightly and kept them closed until I heard a splashing noise nearby. Then, I sat upright and let my feet dangle over the edge of the rocky outcrop. The water was further below now, and I couldn't help but wonder how much time had passed while I lay there, blind to the world. There was another splashing sound, and then her body broke the surface of the water below me. I hadn't seen anyone swimming there. Her hair was dark, and her face belonged on the cover of a beauty magazine. She was wearing nothing but a white blouse that was 2 sizes too large for her. The wet fabric revealed a body like something out of Leon's wet dreams. I wanted to grab one of the loose rocks nearby and drop it on her. She scaled the jagged rocks with the fluid grace of a seal emerging from the water. Our eyes met, and she flashed a smile. "I didn't see you up there." Dark hair clung to her skin, droplets of water trailing down her face. "I hope I'm not bothering you." I shrugged. "It's a free country." Then, with a hint of sarcasm, I added, "Couldn't afford a swimsuit?" Her smile turned playful. "I have everything I need." "I bet you do." The bitterness in my voice surprised me, and a twinge of guilt followed. What had she ever done to deserve that? Attempting to recover, I asked, do you like the beach?" "I love the ocean." She fiddled with the wet fabric covering her torso, pulling it away from her skin, only to have it settle back into place just as translucent as before. I got a strange feeling she was doing it for my benefit. Unknowable, uncontrollable, and deeper than any of us could imagine. "That's pretty poetic." "You have such serious eyes," she said. "Tell me your name." I did. Then she moved closer, her face even with mine. Her smile became strange. She leaned in close. I thought she was going to say something, perhaps share a secret. But instead, she kissed me. Electric shocks ran through me. I felt numb. I felt sick. I felt warm all over. The kiss broke. "Who are you?" I breathed. Before she dove off the rock pier, she uttered just one word, "Ophelia." The name caught me off guard. I was still in shock from our kiss and didn't even hear the splash when she hit the water. Scrambling drunkenly to my feet, I raced back to my parents. The hot sand of the beach burning my feet, the taste of seawater heavy in my mouth, the cool breeze wafting off the ocean making me shiver. Or maybe it was something else making me shiver. I found my family packing up. My mother asked where I had been, and my father demanded to know what I had been up to. I made an excuse about riptides and losing track of where I was, and they believed it. All the while, Leon and his friends watched me and shared conspiratorial grins. On the walk back to the cabin, the girl in the Christie Brinkley swimsuit said, "Your brother told us all about you." I was about to say something sarcastic when one of the guys said, "Why are you wearing lipstick?" That stopped me dead in my tracks. I realized the taste in my mouth that I had taken to be seawater was something else. When I touched my lips with my fingers, they came back stained red. When had I bitten my lip? A noise outside the cabin startled me awake. I went to my cracked bedroom window and peered out into the darkness. I didn't know how late at night it was, but sunrise must have been hours away. The noise was like whispering. It wasn't just one voice, but several. Yet, even as that thought occurred, uncertainty crept in. Were they really voices? Somehow, I just wasn't sure. What I was sure of was that, somehow, the sounds were familiar to me, like something out of a dream. I needed to know what it was, so I quickly threw on the clothes I had worn the day before and quietly made my way to the front door. Careful not to wake anyone else in the cabin. There were no stars or moon, just the shadowy outline of low-hanging clouds. As I stepped onto the porch, I nearly stumbled over the empty cooler that had been left behind by my parents. There was a sickening moment when I thought I was going to fall flat on my face, but I caught myself on the railing. The air was warm and thick. Without thinking, I stepped off the porch and began to follow the sound of the whispers that were not whispers. My steps were cautious and shuffling as I waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. Gradually, I realized I was making my way along the familiar path to the beach. The ocean was a mirror of the starless sky. I knew it was there only by the salty breeze and the rumbling crash of the waves. The sound of waves was so loud that it drowned out the whispers, but they were still there. I closed my eyes, trading one darkness for another, and tried to orient myself to the sound. I was sure it was somewhere to the east, but before I could follow it, I heard a familiar voice. It was the stranger from the phone. Ophelia. My heart began to pound in my chest. Sick with fear, I spun in place, looking for him, but I might as well have had my eyes closed. Ophelia. A figure emerged from the blackness, the outline of a man shuffling along the shore. His shoulders were hunched. I could imagine the tears running down his face, the gaunt face looking far older than the body that carried it. You said you'd be here, he said, his voice fading into the sound of the ocean. You promised. Certain he believed he was alone, I began to back away slowly. I didn't dare run. With every step, I feared he would notice me and, despite my very different shape, mistake me for Ophelia. What was it I'd heard my father say to Leon? Something about every woman being the same in the dark. The not quite whispers were closer now. I followed the sound until I found myself where the rocky outcropping that had nearly killed me met the beach. Fear and curiosity drove me to make my way along the ugly crag. Water lapped at my feet, numbing them almost immediately, more by instinct than anything else. I stopped at the edge of the outcrop. The waves were knee-level now, splashing against me relentlessly, trying to push me back. There was inky blackness all around me. The whispering chorus stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. Impossibly, the sound of the waves also vanished, and I stood there unmoving, unseeing and unhearing. It made me remember that when I was a little girl, this is what I had imagined being dead felt like. I found you. The sound of the stranger's voice jolted me. He was close behind me, a fast-approaching shadow. Panicked, I ran blindly and blundered over the side of the rock formation into the dark water. Cold oblivion consumed me. I regained consciousness in a cave lit by unseen candles. Strange symbols adorned the walls, and the air was heavy with the scent of salt water and decay. As my vision adjusted, I saw slender, ethereal shapes moving in the shadows, tending to something, an ugly silhouette that thrashed and gurgled. A familiar figure loomed over me, wet. Dark hair and sea-blue eyes filled my vision. Her hand stroked my face, gentle yet firm. Ophelia, I said. You've been asleep for so long. She propped my head up, bringing a clamshell to my lips. The water was salty and stung, but before I could protest, I realized I was naked. My clothes lay spread across the rock floor, slowly drying. Humiliated, I curled into a ball, trying to cover myself. Don't look at me, I whispered. Ophelia grabbed my wrists and pulled me into a sitting position. You have nothing to be ashamed of. She was naked, too, her skin gleaming as though she had just left the water. None of us do. My heart raced, on the verge of tears. Where am I? Among friends. She drew me close. I glanced at the feminine shapes lingering in the shadows. They had drawn closer to the figure at their feet. A sound reminiscent of a fish being scaled echoed in the cave, followed by a familiar sob. It was the man from the phone. "Who are they?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "Ophelia." "I thought you were—" I began. "We are all Ophelias," she said, her expression darkening, born to be martyrs in men's eyes. I said, "I don't understand." Ophelia's mouth became an angry frown. "We can be daughters, lovers, even angels, but we can never be free from that hateful thing they pretend is love." I asked, "Why did you bring me here? Why don't you stay? You don't even know my name." I breathed. "You don't know who I am?" "Do you?" she said with a kiss. She pushed me down onto my back as her lips moved across my skin. Each kiss felt like a cold drop of winter rain. Dizziness washed over me. It was like I was on an elevator that wouldn't stop going up. "Who do you want to be?" "Are you who others say you are?" Ophelia started running her nails hard across my chest and belly. I wanted to escape. I never wanted to leave. It was like she was taking me, making me hers. Blood welled up from the cuts and scrapes. She kissed the wounds she had made, one by one, her lips smearing red. The cave was filled with whispered songs that had no words. Her murmuring joined them. When it was over, she held me close. "I love you," the voice of the man from the phone said. He sounded like he was drowning. "Isn't that enough?" He coughed twice and then fell silent. The candles began to go out one by one, and shadows began to swallow her, trying to snatch her away from me. I kissed her hard on the mouth, losing myself in her. In a matter of seconds, I was lost in darkness. It was late in the morning when I awoke. I was lying flat on my back on the crag. The clouds above were a stormy purple, and the rain was coming down hard. I was soaking wet, and my clothes were plastered to my skin. I heard a familiar voice calling my name, but it wasn't one I wanted to hear. I moaned, half with exhaustion, half with anguish. My skin still ached and tingled in the places Ophelia had clawed at me. With trembling hands, I crawled to the ledge and looked down. The tide had gone out. 15 feet below me, Leon was trudging along the surf, wet and miserable, and shouting my name. "Leon," I called out. For a hilarious moment, he was utterly bewildered, his square head swiveling back and forth. I called again, "Up here." When he finally saw me, he started screaming. "You are in big trouble. Dad is seriously pissed." "I just went for a walk." "A walk? You've been gone for over a day." Leon blundered closer until he was directly below me. I could have spit on him if I wanted to. I scowled down at him, remembering all the times he had disappeared for an entire weekend without a single phone call, only to return to a gentle reprimand from our father instead of a harsh scolding and a slap to the back of the head. I used one of his excuses. I was with friends. The expression on his face twisted as if he were looking at something disgusting. "Dolores told me she saw you here last night." Bile rose up in my throat. "So what? She saw what you were doing. Are you crazy? Why can't you just be normal? What is wrong with—" A stone the size of a bowling ball crashed down on Leon, crushing his skull. He collapsed face down into the surf, blood clouding the seawater. I scrambled to my feet to find Ophelia standing near me. "You killed him," I said. The waves greedily pulled at Leon's body, twisting and bending it like a rag doll, only to push it back up the sand again. I know I should have felt something, but I didn't. "What am I going to do?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of the rain and the racing of my own thoughts. "What do you want to do?" "I want to be with you." The rain pelted us. It was getting cold and dark, but it didn't matter. I felt safe in her arms. "I want to be with you forever." "Then be with us," she said. "What about Leon?" Ophelia chuckled coldly. "What about him?" "But the police will find out," I said. She released me and stepped to the edge of the crag. In the deep dark, she said, "We are free from judgment." The downpour had become torrential. Ophelia's words caused me to gaze longingly at the ocean. Each wave crashed against the shore with a powerful roar, sending spray and mist into the air. She kissed my forehead. There were no second thoughts, no worries. I turned and started walking back to the cabin. After a few minutes, I turned back to look for Ophelia. Through the storm, I saw 4 hazy but unmistakably masculine figures standing by Leon's body, moving clumsily. They lifted his limp form and carried it into the sea. From the moment I stepped into the cabin, my father started screaming at me. My mother was silent and glared reproachfully. The stinging sensation of my scratches was intensifying to the point of almost being pleasurable. Turning away from them, I walked calmly to the kitchenette. Their voices seemed distant, as if echoing from the base of a rocky cliff during low tide. Steady-handed, I reached into the kitchen drawer and retrieved a steak knife. My father's insult rang out. "Oh, Jesus Christ, she's going to make a sandwich." Ignoring him was easy. Everything he said was familiar. I waited until his temper broke, and he all but ran at me. He violently grabbed my shoulder, yanking me around to face him. The knife was dull, but my strength proved more than sufficient to slice open his throat. Blood splattered across both our faces. His scream was gurgling and wet, his mouth gaping like a fish. He stumbled backward, clutching at his neck, tripped over his own feet, and collapsed. I stood there, watching as my father spent the final moments of his life weeping. When it was over, I looked to my mother. She had been standing by watching, just like always. "Angela, please." She cowered at my approach. I raised the bloody knife above my head. "That's not my name." There was enough kerosene left in the cabin's rusty heater to start a good fire. I watched the structure burn for a little while. I felt nothing. I hadn't felt anything at all since I left Ophelia's arms. When I was finished, I headed for the shore. And now the storm has left the beach deserted, and the ocean crashes and roars against the surf. I am alone and covered with blood. Standing on the slowly retreating waterline, I watch for the first signs of sunrise. I'm waiting. I've been waiting so long. But Ophelia said she'd be here. She promised. The tingling under my skin was painful. I ripped at my clothes and tore madly at the scabs. They broke open easily. The flesh beneath them was unblemished and gleaming. I waded out into the cold, crashing water, leaving my shirt, shorts, and long red strips of my flesh behind. In the unknowable depths, I would never be a daughter, a punchline, or a scapegoat. I would be free. With each footstep, the roar of the waves changed, becoming softer and prayer-like. It sounded like a chorus of voices calling out the name Ophelia, voices so very much like mine. Story 2. I put a killer in jail. It was the worst mistake I ever made. I'll try to keep this concise, given that I'm in serious need of timely advice. I'm a college-bound high school senior, and since I'm about to be in debt for the rest of my life, I decided a few weeks ago to pick up a summer job. My friend, Liam, and I both found part-time positions at an ice cream store in town. Not the best-paying job, but our schedules were flexible, and given the popularity, or lack thereof, of the shop, we basically got to sit on our asses all day and play video games on Liam's Steam Deck. The job did have one downside, though, which was the shop's owner, Fred. Fred was an older guy, probably in his 60s. I have no clue where he came from or what he did before moving into my town 15 years ago, but from the way he carried himself, I always thought he had a military background. He was tall and wiry, and had this stare that felt like he was peeling back your skin with his eyes alone. I had no idea what a guy like that was doing, running a kitschy little ice cream shop called Sunday Central, but the events of the past few weeks have given me some theories. So a few hours before our first 4:10 p.m. shift, Fred gave Liam and me a tour. The shop was too small for its own cold room, and so the back room had 2 standing freezers. It also had one giant chest freezer which, as I learned a few days later, was locked. When I asked Fred about it, he told me that it was for surplus inventory, and I didn't really care enough to inquire further. The last thing Fred told us was to be wary of a homeless woman who sometimes begged outside of the store and had been known to be aggressive. Fred watched Liam and me closely throughout our first shift, which luckily went off without a hitch. At 10 p.m. sharp, he told us to grab our things and go. Apparently, Fred liked to clean and close up shop himself. Bro, that guy's kinda weird, right? Liam asked me that night as we carpooled back to our neighborhood. I shrugged. I didn't have much of an opinion on our boss yet. I used to live in the same apartment building as him before we moved. He continued, I ran into him a lot in the parking garage. He always had some kind of animal with him. Dogs, cats, sometimes even a trap with a raccoon or a possum inside. I figured he worked at some kind of animal rescue or something. Maybe he catches stray animals and takes them to the vet. Like, for sterilization and stuff. Yeah, maybe. Liam's observation was strange, but all in all, Fred seemed normal enough to me. A little aloof, sure, but I was happy to look past that as long as he was paying us. I dropped Liam off that night and didn't think much about those animals for a while. The first few weeks on the job were more stressful than anticipated. Aside from all the screaming children and entitled parents, I eventually encountered the woman that Fred had warned us about. The first time I saw her, I was working the closing shift alone while Liam was at a concert with his girlfriend. My car was a block away from Sunday Central, and as I walked down the poorly lit street, I got the sense that I was being watched. I turned to look at the shrubs lining the sidewalk, and was greeted by the last thing I expected to see crouched inside the hedges, a person. I barely saw her with all the branches twisting around her body, but once I noticed her sallow, expressionless face, I realized that she was looking right at me. I was so surprised that I tripped on a crack in the sidewalk and damn near broke my wrist. By the time I stood up and shook off my embarrassment, she was gone. Liam and I saw her every once in a while after that. She wasn't aggressive like Fred had mentioned, nor did she bother our customers at all. She kept to herself and largely out of sight. But even so, I came to dread being in the shop after sunset. I got into the habit of standing by the front windows when there was a lull in our customer stream. I would stare out into the night and look for the woman. It would always take me a few minutes, but often I would eventually find someone looking back at me. She was always partially obscured, either by trees or street lamps or dumpsters. It felt like she was playing a game with me, like some kind of demented Where's Waldo. On the nights where I didn't find her, I always wondered if she hadn't paid us a visit, or if I simply hadn't looked hard enough. 1 week ago, as soon as I pulled into my driveway after work, I realized that I had left my wallet in my work locker. Since I was going out with friends the following morning, I opted to drive back to Sunday Central immediately, as opposed to waiting until the next day. It was almost 11 when I pulled up next to the shop, and I remember being surprised by how abandoned the street looked once all the businesses closed for the day. Only when I exited my car did I realize that the shop would probably be locked up. Sure enough, the front door handle didn't budge. I decided to try the back door before I gave up entirely. I rounded the building and approached our back door, and to my delight, I found that it was unlocked. At that point, I was too relieved to consider how strange that was. I opened the door and slipped through, turning my phone flashlight on so that I could navigate in the dark. Sunday Central is set up like this. Most of the building is occupied by a large room that holds the serving counter and dining area for the customers. Behind the serving counter is a hallway that leads to the back door to the shop. On one side of the hallway is the bathroom and break room, and on the other side is the freezer room. Once I entered through the back door, I turned into the break room. For some reason, I didn't want to turn on the lights. If the back door was unlocked, then Fred might still be around somewhere, and the thought of running into him in the middle of the night gave me the creeps. I just wanted to grab my wallet and slip back out as quickly as I could. Luckily, my wallet was exactly where I thought I'd left it. I grabbed it, put it in my pocket, and was just about to leave before I heard the back door open. Shit, I thought. If that was Fred, and he found me snooping around with all the lights off, he'd probably think I was robbing the place. Could I be arrested for trespassing at my own place of employ? I wasn't in the mood to find out. Not knowing what else to do, I gently closed the locker and dove behind the break room couch. From my hiding place, if I peered around the side of the couch, I could see right across the hallway to the door to the freezer room. The hallway lights clicked on, and footsteps echoed through the quiet shop as Fred ambled into view. He looked tired, his expression downcast and his gait slow. He was wearing a clear, plastic poncho, which I found strange, but any thoughts I might have had on his attire, I immediately forgot when I saw what he was dragging across the floor behind him. It was a body, a woman's body, nude and either unconscious or dead. Fred was holding her, by the hair in one of his gloved hands. He pushed open the door to the freezer room and turned on the lights, and immediately I could tell he was holding a corpse by the hue of its skin and the rigidity of its limbs. I bit back a gasp as I watched him drag it into the room. Just after he crossed the threshold, part of the corpse's scalp detached from its skull. It fell from his grasp, flopping onto the floor with a thud, leaving Fred holding a fistful of long, brunette hair. He cursed to himself, turning around and leaning over to pick up the body. I ducked behind the couch, watching his feet through the small gap between the couch and the floor. His hand stilled on the corpse's neck, and I figured he'd just noticed the open door to the break room. I held my breath, praying he'd let it go, but instead he straightened and stepped over the body. I watched his shoes cross the hallway, coming to a stop in the doorway. He reached inside and switched on the lights. I readied myself for a fight, figuring that if I couldn't incapacitate Fred, maybe I could at least injure him badly enough that he'd be a suspect when people realized I'd disappeared. Luckily for me, it never came to that. A small, barely audible knock sounded through the quiet shop, and Fred reacted immediately. He turned his attention back towards the corpse, picking it up off of the floor and making his way towards the front of the store. As soon as he was out of sight, I crawled out from behind the couch. I looked down the hallway in both directions, and when I didn't see Fred, I bolted for the back door. I ran to my car like my life depended on it, which, as far as I knew, it did. I drove straight to the police station to file a report. I probably should have waited to get my thoughts in order, but I was so hopped up on adrenaline that I barged right in and gave what was probably a completely incoherent account of my night. Understandably, the officers didn't seem to believe me at first, but the more questions they asked, the more seriously they took my story. I'm sure that dropping the name Frederick Braun helped my case. Liam wasn't the only one who thought Fred was a little off. He'd long been something of an outsider in our town, and it's likely because of his reputation that the police agreed to investigate the scene. They found 7 corpses in Sunday Central, though none belonged to a human. Squished together in the locked chest freezer were 2 cats, a raccoon, a coyote, and 3 dogs, one of which I recognized as a neighbor's pet from lost posters I'd seen stapled to telephone poles. The discovery sent the town into an uproar. Fred was arrested the following morning, and needless to say, our ice cream shop was shut down. The police said they'd do some DNA testing on the crime scene to identify the woman I saw. Of course, I was happy that something was being done, but I didn't have high hopes for our tiny, underfunded police department. At least I could rest easy, knowing I'd helped put a criminal in jail, even though I got the sense there was more to the story. Fred was arrested 6 days ago, 3 days after the incident. Liam and I were driving home from a friend's house across town. Our route took us past Sunday Central, and Liam slowed down to gawk at the yellow tape adorning our former workplace. Only when we were a few buildings away did I notice a person standing on the street across from Sunday Central. "Dude, holy shit," I said, pointing to the figure. "It's that woman." When Liam saw her, he did just about the last thing I wanted him to do and pulled over right in front of her. He came to a stop and, despite my protests, rolled down my window to talk to her. The woman was standing on the sidewalk, maybe 2 feet away from the passenger's side door. I shrunk back in my seat, horrified by the prospect that she could reach right through the open window if she wanted to. "Hey, lady," Liam said, "we're closed." This was by far the closest I'd ever been to the woman. At a glance, she was pretty normal looking, pale skin, dark hair, brown eyes, or Were they brown? Her irises looked faintly reddish in the poor lighting, maybe the result of some kind of infection. She was wearing a nondescript black dress that seemed too pristine for someone I assumed had been living on the street. She didn't look at us when we pulled up next to her, didn't move a muscle. In all the times I'd noticed her staring at me, had I ever seen her move?
Hello?
Liam continued. No ice cream today, or tomorrow, or ever. Probably. Our boss might have been a serial killer. You hear anything about that? He elbowed my arm like he was trying to get me in on the joke, but I barely registered his words. I couldn't look away from the woman's face, which, before my eyes, seemed to shift. I'm not exactly sure what I saw, or how best to describe it. Have you ever stared into a mirror in a dimly lit room? If you stare at your face long enough, your brain starts playing tricks on you. Your features start to distort. You start seeing someone else, a family member, a stranger, something different, something wrong. That's the best analogy I can give for what I felt in the moment. All of a sudden, I got the sense that the person I was looking at wasn't a person at all. The woman's eyes flicked from the storefront to Liam's face. Dude, drive, I said, reaching out to roll up the window. But, drive, I practically screamed right into his face. Grumbling, Liam slammed on the gas and took us screeching down the road. I turned in my seat to watch the woman as we left. She didn't move an inch all the while. Call me a coward if you want. But between that encounter and what I'd witnessed at Sunday Central, I haven't left my house for the past few days. Even now, as I write this, the memory of that woman makes me feel ill. I've never, in my entire life, seen something so uncanny. And the fact that Liam didn't notice anything made me feel like I was losing it. I mean, I had just seen my boss dragging someone's dead body across the floor of an ice cream shop. Some degree of paranoia wouldn't be all that out of the question. For the past few days, I've been staying at home with my grandma, playing cards with her and keeping an eye on the news. It took days for the police to make any headway on the Frederick Braun case. But yesterday morning, they seemed to have finally made a breakthrough. From a strand of hair left on the floor at Sunday Central, they were able to identify the body I'd seen as 34-year-old Alicia Winters. The only problem? Alicia Winters died 4 days before the incident. She'd been involved in a fatal car crash and was 6 feet underground in our town cemetery. Or at least, she should have been. When police exhumed her grave, they found an empty casket. Alicia's grave wasn't the only one that had been disturbed. Investigative efforts turned fully towards the cemetery, where it was found that several other graves had fallen victim to unauthorized disinterment. At the time of writing this, they found 8 empty caskets, and I have a feeling that the number will continue to rise. I had trouble wrapping my head around the news. What motive could Frederick possibly have had for killing those animals and stealing those corpses? How long has all of this been going on? And maybe the most important question of all, where were the corpses? I got a phone call last night. I'd already passed out in front of the TV and was awoken by my cell phone vibrating in my pocket. It was 4 in the morning when I picked up Liam's call.
Hello?
I asked groggily. She's at my bedroom window. I sat bolt upright. Who? I asked, though deep down I already knew. I just woke up and she's just standing outside. You have to call the police. Are your parents there? My parents and sister. His voice was shaky and small. I've never seen a person with teeth like this. Liam, you gotta call the police. Man, wake up your parents and call the police right now. He sucked in a sharp breath. Okay. Yeah, I'll call the police. Text me when they get there. Okay? I will. He hung up after that, and I was alone in the quiet dark again. I don't know what I was thinking. I shouldn't have let him go. I should have called the police on his behalf. Instead, I waited for a text that never came. For hours I sat on the couch, looking at my reflection in the TV screen in front of me, watching my face distort into something foreign, something inhuman. In the morning, The light streaming in through the living room windows broke me out of my trance. I forced myself to get up and get in the car, and I drove like a maniac to Liam's house. We were such good friends. You know, I had my own set of keys to his place. His parents joke that I was their second son. The adult human skeleton has 206 bones. I found maybe 40 of them. Vertebrae splintered and stuck in his mattress. Half a rib cage discarded on his floor. Something long, maybe a femur or a tibia, embedded in his wall. How strange it was that for all the carnage, all those scratches and dents in the floor and ceiling, I didn't see a drop of blood. His parents and younger sister were in a similar state. I didn't find them myself. I called the police after seeing what I saw in Liam's room, but I could tell from the officers' expressions that they had been similarly brutalized. They took me in for questioning. Of course, since I've now been found at the center of 2 crime scenes, but I doubt I offered them any valuable answers. I don't know what has descended upon my town. I don't know exactly what it did to Liam's family, or why, but I suspect that the person with all the answers, the person who was protecting my town all this time without anyone knowing, is currently behind bars because of me. Maybe I can find a way to talk to him. Maybe I can find a way to convince everyone of his innocence. If not, then I'll have to take matters into my own hands. I'll have to feed the monster I set free. Story 3. I rushed into a rental agreement with a random couple to save money. I wish that I hadn't. Up until this a few years ago, I hadn't had any problems with roommates or neighbors since I moved away from the big city. The whole reason why I did it was to get away from all the noise. Years of footsteps thumping above my head, music blaring from another apartment, yelling in some dingy alley. I could hear just about anything, loud and clear, through the paper-thin walls of my old place. When I finally graduated college and found a remote job, I could go somewhere where I could get some much-needed peace and quiet. Part of me wanted to wait until I saved up enough for a mortgage, but I was so sick of the crap by that point that I was willing to take what I could get. After searching for listings, I found a spare bedroom in a small town about an hour away. A drive-through town with nothing of note. Really, but I wasn't really looking for much action. Just a place I could stay in for about a year until I saved up some money. I'd be living in a 1-story flat alongside a couple, which was immediately a bit weird to me. Why would they want to live with some single dude in his late 20s? I shrugged it off. Since the rent was cheap and I didn't want to be judgmental of someone else's financial situation, looks like I'd just have to get used to third-wheeling a lot. After talking to the couple over the phone, they agreed to grab lunch with me at some diner at the edge of town to discuss the possibility of me renting the room. They seemed relatively normal. John worked in IT, and it showed. Bags under his blue eyes. A constant air of slight nervousness, even though it was a Saturday. He was nice enough, though, and since I'm also in the tech industry, we talked about video games for a bit while his wife was in the bathroom. Monica was an odd duck. For sure, she was gorgeous, but quiet. She had a beautiful head of long red hair and stunning green eyes. As compared to John's more laid-back demeanor, she was high-strung, her eyes darting across the diner, reacting to every possible noise. Hell, if her boyfriend wasn't so low energy, I'd think she was on something, and I'm still not sure she's not. But I brushed it off. After all, I couldn't exactly read her well. She barely spoke 5 words the entire time I was there. Aside from the occasional affirmation of what John was saying, I just chalked it up to her being shy, and figured that if I ended up living with them, we could be friendly. They gave me a rundown of how they ran their household, and it was pretty standard. No loud noise after 10 p.m, no dishes left in the sink, clean the bathroom on a rotating schedule. I don't like a messy space, either, so that wasn't a problem. There were some strange requests from them, though. The first was that I couldn't turn any lights on after 10 p.m, apart from my rooms. John said it was because he got migraines easily from artificial light, and we agreed to a small night light in the main hallway so that I could find the bathroom at night. The weirdest request, though, was the fact that the basement was off limits. They said it was because of mold that the landlord kept delaying a fix for. and they alleviated it, spreading to the rest of the house with some spray they put on the basement stairs. They insisted that I don't go down there until it's fixed, and that I could store my excess stuff in the hall closet. To be honest, I didn't have much that couldn't fit in the room, so I didn't have a problem with that, and bought the story. I agreed to their rules, gave them the first month's rent up front, and we were all set. The first week living there went pretty smoothly. I spent most of it moving stuff into my room and doing training for my new job. I ate dinner with John and Monica on the second night, and I thought it went well. John and I talked about our self-care routines, as people in our field have the reputation for being shut-ins with bad hygiene, and we both seem to be outliers. The conversation mostly consisted of me giving him tips on my favorite hairstyling products, and him giving me skincare tips. He stressed the importance of good skincare to me. He said that there's no better feeling than having new skin. He quickly clarified that he meant freshly exfoliated skin, and I chucked at his verbal misstep. I thought that was a bit of a weird way to describe it, but I agreed with the general sentiment. Monica seemed to be opening up to me, speaking to me about twice as much as she did before. That was still only about 10 words total, but progress is progress. She seemed like a nice woman with a staring problem. Every time I'd glance over at her, she'd be looking right at me, with her eyes wide open and her face blank. She'd always quickly look away, though, and I was mid-conversation, so I didn't really think anything of it at the time. It was on the 8th night of staying there that I heard it for the first time. It was very brief, and just loud enough that I could barely hear it over the fan on my nightstand, this little croaking type noise. It sounded like it was either somewhere in my room or directly outside of it. Admittedly, it did freak me out a bit, and I hopped up and shut the fan off to try and hear it better, as soon as the fan was off. Though the room stayed silent, I assumed that it was just old house noises and turned the fan back on so that I could go to bed. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have just gone back to bed without a little investigation, but after I calmed down, I kind of just defaulted to the most rational explanation. After all, I had a Zoom call in the morning. The next day, I was walking by the basement door when it hit me. There was this awful smell coming from behind it. I didn't want to break the rules less than 2 weeks into living here, so I went into the kitchen where John was making lunch and told him about it. He didn't seem fazed by it. He told me it was probably just an animal that found its way into the basement and died, and assured me he'd go and check when he finished eating. To his credit, he did just that, and came back up affirming that it was a dead raccoon. I didn't stick around to see him drag it out of the basement. I had work to do, so I left him to it. I heard another noise that night. It was different from the one I'd heard yesterday, but it was equally as disturbing. It was this panting noise, like a dog would do after sprinting across the yard to fetch a ball. I turned the fan off, and like it did before, the noise immediately stopped. To put it politely, I was losing my shit at this point, and stayed up the rest of the night getting work done. I wasn't sure if there was some animal in the house, or what, but what I heard didn't come from the house. It couldn't have. I sat down at the dinner table the next night, since John and I had planned to grill that night, and immediately asked John if he was outside my room last night. I probably should have waited a bit before asking that, since he kind of just stared at me with this blank look that didn't have any emotion in it. His face quickly morphed into a confused expression, though, and he assured me that he had slept through the night and didn't come near my space. I was a bit skeptical, since I didn't know what kind of animal could be making those kinds of noises, but I disregarded it at that moment to ask if Monica was joining us. He shook his head with a slight grin on his face and said that she was away on business. Thinking about it, I hadn't seen her since I had dinner with them a week ago, so I joked about her taking a vacation on the company's dime. He laughed and said she was in Vegas, in the sweltering heat. That sounded like literal hell to me, but hey, maybe she'd win big and rent would go down, or they'd just kick me out. One of the two. I had a few nights of peaceful sleep before it happened again. It was a different sound, a mix of two. In fact, a scraping noise that seemed to be coming from the door, and what sounded like someone whispering. I quietly got out of bed and, without turning the fan off, crept over to the door and put my ear against it. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman's voice, but it was right there. They were speaking in gibberish, a mix of English words and garbled nonsense. One phrase stood out to me. That was said a couple of times, although it didn't seem to mean anything. New skin. At that moment, I tried to get onto my knees and peer under the crack in the door, but the floorboard creaked under my weight. I'm honestly surprised they didn't sooner, but this was the worst possible moment for it. The scraping and whispering immediately stopped, and after a moment of silence, a new noise filled the empty air, what sounded like muffled crying. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed down the hallway and stopped just as suddenly as it started. I was freaked the fuck out and knew I couldn't stay another night in this place without figuring out what was going on. I was too chicken shit to open the door and peek into the hallway to see if I could see anything, so I did the next best thing. I cracked the door open and slid my phone out of the crack. With the camera facing into the hallway, I sat against the door, blocking it with my weight for about 3 minutes. And as I yanked my phone back into the room, I heard a few more footsteps further down the hall. I wasn't sleeping that night, and immediately started throwing my shit into the moving boxes that lay folded against my wall. I didn't check the footage that night. I couldn't bring myself to. 4 hours or so later, the sun was rising, and I felt safe to crack the door open and peek out. The hallway was empty, but I noticed that the night light I'd stuck into the outlet was gone. I didn't question it. I grabbed my keys off of the hanger in the hallway and got out of there. I drove for about 10 miles before pulling into the parking lot of some restaurant and finally taking a deep breath. I still didn't want to look at the video. I returned to the house later that day, intent on grabbing my stuff and leaving. I didn't sign any lease, so I didn't need to tell them anything. I could just leave and never talk to either of them ever again. I still wasn't convinced it was John pranking me, but I didn't have any other explanation for anything I heard. The house was empty, or at least I thought it was. It's not like I was going to call out for John to see if he was home. He should have been at work. Anyway, what was odd, though, was that his and Monica's bedroom door was open. I'd never seen the interior of their room before, and I sure as hell wasn't about to start now. On my last trip into the house to grab the last of my stuff, I was walking back into the hallway, relieved to be finally done, and then it happened. Quicker than I could process. The basement door at the end of the hallway flew open, and a high-pitched shriek echoed through the house. It sounded like the weeping I had heard the other night, only mutated into a full-blown wailing. I dropped my box and froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. The shriek abruptly stopped, and there was silence. Slowly, something poked its head above the top step of the basement stairs, as if it was lying down on the steps. I saw Monica, her hair, her face, her eyes, looking at me with a grin plastered across her face. Her skin was wrinkled, and her eyes looked like they were sunken into her head. She didn't speak as I stood there, completely paralyzed. She just looked at me. She suddenly shrieked again, as her bottom lip drooped down to reveal her gums. Not wanting to run down the hallway towards her, I ducked into the couple's room. Since mine didn't have a window I could use to get out of there, I shut the door behind me as loud footsteps quickly encroached on my location, and immediately there was pounding and screaming on the outside of the bedroom door. I tipped the cabinet over to try and block the door, and immediately started pulling on the window, trying to open it. The banging on the door was starting to turn into smashing. I finally got the window open, and without looking back, I jumped out and booked it to my car. 12:47 p.m. I drove until I had to fill up my tank, and then drove some more. I tried not to think about what had just happened, but I couldn't help it. I thought about what would have happened if I couldn't get the window open. Then I thought about the bedroom. It was a weird layout. There was a twin bed instead of a bigger size, and no women's accessories or clothes in sight. Eventually, I pulled over and stayed at a motel for the night. And before I went to bed, I pulled out my phone and deleted the video I had taken. I'd been putting off watching it, and I didn't want to see it. This whole thing happened 2 years ago. I would have been content with never telling anyone about this, as I didn't want to have to picture that thing in my head again. But something happened that made me want to write it down. The other day, I was searching through my iCloud to send pictures of my childhood home to my Tinder match, since we apparently grew up in the same town and I wanted to prove it. when I saw it. The video I had deleted that night. It had apparently uploaded itself to iCloud, as things do when you have that enabled. I made a stupid decision. I decided to watch it. The video was dark. Obviously, it was in a hallway at 2 a.m. The only thing providing any semblance of visibility was the nightlight I had set up. About of the way through the video, something moved into the light. It was the thing, but this time, I could see it in its entirety. It was wrinkly, and way taller than Monica was. It moved closer to the camera, walking shakily on two legs. It got down onto its knees, and its repulsive face stared right into the camera, grinning. Its eyes were indeed sunken, as I'd noticed back then, since it was so close. Though, I could see new details about it that I couldn't have possibly seen before. For one, Monica didn't have blue eyes, like this thing did. Secondly, I'm pretty sure she didn't have a second set of lips under hers. Story 4. I work at a toll booth on a lonely country road. Please, stay away. I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the great inconvenience of your trip being interrupted to be charged a few bucks just to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged up freeway with lines of cars packed together, waiting to pay and move on. I can imagine the people who work at those booths find it even more boring than you do. The one I work at couldn't be further from the stereotype. The toll booth I operate is situated on a small country road that curves a few times along its path through the woods surrounding it, far away from any bustling highway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack, with chipped paint and an old sign that reads 25C, an amount I don't believe has changed since sometime in the 50s. I guess that's when they decided to stop pretending it was a normal toll booth. Its only accessory is the barrier arm I can flip up or down. The interior is simple, with a single chair and a light on the ceiling, the only light besides the moon for miles. It only has one operator on any given night. Most nights, that's me, on the surface. It doesn't make sense why our local government would pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere to operate a booth that makes no money. And believe me, they pay well, but if you spent a single night out there, you would understand why. No, there isn't a sudden influx of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at 3 a.m. What we protect by keeping this booth running is worth far more than any monetary cost could make up for. In my town, the job of operating the lonely booth is one that is highly respected and rarely spoken of. In fact, it's something of an unspoken rule that you keep private any conversations about the booth, the road, or anything related. Everyone around here knows there's something off about this place. Almost everyone has seen something they can't explain, or something they wish they hadn't. A lot of rural towns have their own urban legends. Most of the time, their residents embrace the myths. I suspect it's because they all know it's a myth, save for a few crazies. Our town is the opposite. We keep quiet about the things we've seen. The most we can do around here is to steer people clear of the road and hope nothing strays from it. The last we wanted was for the rest of the world to find out. And I suspect we're not the only ones. You see, our town is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to crumble or degrade. Our public schools are well funded, and no one is ever stuck looking for work. The reason this is noteworthy is that our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous region of America. This money is coming from somewhere, and it's not from our little property taxes. I've got a suspicion that the feds, or someone else, is dumping money into our town, and that they're keeping tabs on our little toll booth situation as well. I know this all sounds ridiculous now, but once you get a better idea of my job, and of recent events, I think you'll understand. As I said, the booth only has one operator each night, a tradition that goes as far back as we've been a town. Each week, we hold a private meeting at our town hall. At this meeting are all current toll booth attendants and any former ones who can make it. Most of the time, the meetings don't last longer than 15 minutes, but after the emergency meeting I called a few weeks ago, we've held them every day, and they've been taking a lot longer, the reason for which you will know soon enough. I suppose this is a good time to explain what happens at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. Rule 1. The booth does not need to be attended during the day. Not much happens at the booth when the sun is up. But the attendant for the night, which is usually me, must be at the booth an hour before sunset and stay an hour after sunrise. The attendant for the night is not to leave the booth at any time during their shift, for any reason. Transportation isn't an issue because either the sheriff or one of the deputies always gives us a ride to the booth at night and a ride back to town in the morning. Rule 2, no cell phone. Radio or other electronic or communication device is allowed while operating the booth at night. The only thing running on electricity that a booth attendant is allowed to have is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device accidentally, shut it off, store it inside the booth, and pray that it doesn't turn itself back on. Leaving it outside the booth is not an option. Should your device turn itself on inside of the booth, your next best bet is to destroy it. This sounds like a drastic measure, but I've made this mistake before. I lasted about an hour before I couldn't take the screams coming from my phone and stomped it into oblivion. Haven't made the mistake of taking it with me again. I've never been told what the screams and other noises are, but I do know that past attendants have heard the same thing. Rule 3, rare as they are, cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. A common trait among those who end up on this road at night is confusion. The attendant's job is to decide whether they will be let through or turned away. The driver, along with confusion, may express other emotions. They may be distressed, angry, paranoid, or fearful. Try to calm them down and put their minds at ease as best you can. Once you believe they are ready, you will simply ask them to pay their toll. One of two outcomes will occur. If the driver has no notable reaction, questions you, or hands you a regular quarter, you must leave the barrier arm down and turn them away. Do whatever is necessary to try and make them leave. If they threaten you or attempt to drive through anyway, you can let them know you will be calling the police, even though you have no means of calling them. This scenario is unlikely because no modern navigation system would bring them down this road. All of the locals know not to use it, and it would be unusual for an outsider to learn about it, though we have, on occasion, had to deal with a few lost travelers. Most of the time they are compliant. Get them off the road as soon as possible and direct them towards town where they can get their footing. Above all else, they cannot pass through the gate. However, if you ask them to pay their toll, another outcome is possible, and unfortunately, the most common. They'll come to a sudden realization. As evidenced by their facial expression, it's as if they remember something, slowly reaching into their pocket and pulling out a black coin. They know they'll have to give it to you to pass. Some accept their fate graciously, others cry, but they all follow the road once the barrier arm is lifted. Around the corner, they drive, never to be seen again. In my first months working here, I was confused as to who these people were. I wondered what it was they knew, how they got these coins in the first place, or what the coins were. All I knew was to leave it in the booth to be picked up by the next shift. This was until I happened to be watching the local news one morning after I got home. They talked about a man who was killed in a car accident the night before and showed a picture of his face. A face I had seen only hours before. Puzzled and afraid as he asked me where he was and what was going on. When I asked him for his toll, he froze, slowly reached into his coat pocket with a quivering hand, and pulled out a black coin before placing it in mine. He gripped the steering wheel and faced forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was going. Sitting in my living room that morning, recounting the events of the last hours, I realized that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead, just passing through, as were the dozens I had seen before, and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I realized the road was some kind of path to somewhere beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so surreal that in the moment, all you can do is let autopilot take over and continue with your duties as you were told. But as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades back, a visitor from out of town was passing through town. Back then, He didn't have a phone to give him directions, so he had to go off a map. Even with a map, I'm certain he didn't know of the road because it was never put on any map. My best guess is that he happened to see it and figured it could be some sort of a shortcut. When he approached the gate, he was, of course, turned away by the toll booth attendant, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man got violent with the attendant, pushing him over and raising the arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the past attendants of the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next. Back then, they only knew the rules, not the consequences, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night, the same man in the same car rolled up to the booth. When asked for his toll, this time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, only knowing that he needed to pass through, but not why. This has continued every night for the last several decades. Each night he pulls up, confused as to why he's here and needs to pass, and forgetting each time. Each night he gives us a coin. Each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, not seen until the next night. He never ages and his appearance never changes. Sometimes he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times he expresses a sense that he's been here before and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers sometimes. His fate is one I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemies. Dead, but not being allowed to move on, and never remembering why you're there, living the same moment night after night until who knows when. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but not the only one. Rule 4, at some random point in the night, you may hear something moving through the trees, something big. Sometimes they emerge from the woods, other times they'll be coming down the road. Try not to be afraid. No harm is coming your way. Quite the opposite. However, I can see how this would be hard to believe. In any case, you need to raise the arm and let them through. I remember the first time I saw them. I could hear a clop somewhere down the road, coming towards the booth like a horse galloping. I rose to my feet and grabbed my flashlight. Intrigued, I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse. I had never been told what to do in that scenario. When I did point my flashlight at the road, I nearly had a heart attack at the sight before me. A bull moose was approaching with a brisk walk. Of course, I was warned of this, but the details I was given were vague. All I was told was that a moose might approach the gate, and I was supposed to let it through. I wasn't told that this thing stands at around 9 or 10 feet at the shoulder, or that its fur is so dark I couldn't see it without my flashlight, save for the massive antlers, which are white as snow in contrast. The only other part of its body clearly visible from afar were its eyes, which shone with a small speck of white light, glowing in the darkness. I screamed and retreated to my booth, tempted to run off into the night and abandon my post. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm. This calmed me down, and I slowly raised it, watching as the moose approached to pass. As it did, I noticed the halter and reins on its head. I followed them up, only to meet another set of eyes, identical to the moose's, towering over me. Again, I yelled, but contained my volume when I realized whoever or whatever this was on top of the moose was making eye contact with me as they passed. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose it rode on, something akin to a shadow, just like everyone in their cars. They walked down the road, beyond the bend and out of sight. I had to sit down for half an hour before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy those finer details had been left out. Only after my shift and expressing my frustration was I told more. Apparently, this hunter and his moose have been around a long time. So long that no attendant alive today can remember a time without them. Some believe they've been here for the past couple 100 years or more, possibly as long as the strange road and the booth have been around. What we do know is that they aren't bound to the road like the others. At our town hall, we possess a written account of the hunter and his mount riding right through town in the middle of the night back in 1919. To this day, a few residents have seen the moose while they're driving at night. You may be wondering why I refer to the figure on the moose's back as the hunter. Well, that's what us attendants call him. Every so often he and his moose will arrive at the booth, dragging a corpse behind them. When I say corpse, I don't mean an animal, or even a human for that matter. I mean abominations out of your wildest nightmares. Things that send a shiver down your spine and make you want to vomit at the same time. Things you would expect to find talked about in a religious text when the end of days comes. The hunter drags these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be certain of anything, but if you ask me, he's taking them back to some sort of afterlife or underworld. Maybe it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve. Or maybe somewhere in the road is a pathway to many different places. I couldn't tell you. What I believe, like the other attendants and anyone who knows about the hunter and his moose, is that they're here to protect us. Whatever these things are that he's taking with him aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and he's just here to set things right. Now this is where we get to the point, why I'm telling you about all of this. I explained before that the people from my town like to keep these things quiet. And for the most part I agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a couple of weeks ago, during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going well for the most part. No new dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular, poor old bastard, confused as ever. After him, all was quiet for a few hours until I heard a slow clop coming down the road yet again. These days, I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't fear either of them, and like I said, I've come to respect them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're dragging out. That night was no exception. They approached the gate and stopped in front of it. Before I moved to raise the barrier arm, I shone my flashlight at the rope being dragged behind, and the dreadful thing attached. The end of the rope was tied in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves, hooves that belonged to what looked like the lower half of some sort of deer. As I moved up the body with my flashlight, I quickly discovered that this wasn't just some massive buck. The legs may have been reminiscent of one, but the upper body was that of a man in a striped red and blue clown suit. The sleeves were shredded at the wrist, and protruding from them were long, blackened hands with claws for fingers. The head was by far the most grotesque part. Its nose and mouth, like the rest of its head, were covered in the skin like that of a pale man, but their shape was that of a deer's. Blood dripped out of its half-opened mouth. The ears were similar, with the same pale color and texture as a man's, but shaped like a deer's. It was like someone took human ears and stretched them out, morphing them to fit the disgusting shape they desired. On top sat a red and blue jester hat and a set of antlers sprouting out above them. I froze for a moment upon seeing the entirety of this beast, but snapped out of it when I reminded myself that I had a job to do, and that I better do it if I didn't want to see this thing any longer. I walked over to the barrier arm and raised it. The moose resumed its trot forward along the road and past the gate. As they passed me, I couldn't help but watch the deer clown monster it was dragging behind. A streak of blood followed on the road behind it, right before it passed by the booth completely. I lit up its face with my flashlight to get a final look. Its eyelids shot open, revealing the black and brown eyes underneath. Then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, pain-filled bleat before it leaned down and clawed at the knot holding its hooves. In only a few seconds, the ropes were cut and the beast attempted to stand. It didn't get far in its initial attempt, however, because the bull moose in front of it struck its head with a powerful kick. Another splash of blood came from the clown's mouth, along with one of its teeth, as it fell back to the ground. Seemingly knocked out for a moment, while it recovered, the hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on. I ran from the booth and hid behind a tree to the side of the road, but kept an eye on the fight. Air shot from the moose's nostrils as it began to grunt. His grunts were louder and deeper than the bleats of the deer clown. I could feel my chest vibrate with each powerful grunt. The clown finally stood and stared back at the hunter and moose, letting a few more bleats out, as if to challenge them. At its standing height, this thing was taller than the moose, though it was obvious the moose was much larger and heavier overall. The moose lowered its head and charged. Before it connected, the clown thing attempted to claw at the hunter on its back, but failed. It was picked up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away with the hunter holding the new rope. They began to drag the clown by the neck, I assume hoping to finally make it around the bend this time. Unfortunately, it was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws again. The clown didn't waste any time, hurrying to its hooves and charging into the woods. The hunter on his moose followed. In only a moment, they were both out of sight. I only noticed my heavy breathing after all was quiet again. It took me an hour to work up the courage to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed the tooth from the clown lying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the drive, I contacted everyone else and told them to get there as soon as possible. At the meeting, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a mix of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and none knew what it meant. The agreed-upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week. So we figured he would catch the clown in the next couple of days and all would be sorted. I dearly wish that was what happened. A day later, a video surfaced on the internet from the town over. It showed a pair of deer antlers sticking out above the tops of trees as the man recording was driving. A few days after that, another video. This one was recorded by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to laughter outside. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and part of the hat outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but commenters on the video sure did. Last week, someone halfway across the state uploaded a grainy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees. Far off in the distance, these are just the ones I've seen. Now you can see why we've been having meetings every week. I can tell we're not the only ones in a panic either. Strangers started showing up around town, and not the kind that are just passing through. They try their best to fit in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaway is when they show up to our bars and diners, striking up a conversation before asking folk what they've seen around here lately, asking about the booth and the strange road. In the last week or so, they've stopped trying so hard to hide it. Black government SUVs have been crowding the parking spaces downtown. We kept the tooth in the town hall along with every other document and record we have about the booth. And now it's all missing. It's clear that whatever happened that night wasn't supposed to, and we weren't the only ones who noticed. I didn't work last night, but the attendant who did had a lot to report this morning in our meeting. The feds drove out to the booth and took a look around. He pleaded with them not to drive through, but in response, they told him they already knew why they shouldn't. Something we weren't expecting. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. I suppose I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. As much as we like to keep it a secret in our town, the genie is out of the bottle. I figured I would at least tell all of you before the feds. Every one of you should know what's out there. As for me, I'll keep watching the booth at night. Sticking to my duties is about all I can do. Still, I'll be keeping up with all of the developments that I can. I can only guess based on the posts I've strung together, but it looks like the clown is still on the move, and our hunter close behind. I can only pray that he catches it soon. In the meantime, if you hear strange laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside. Story 5. Furniture. You know that unsettling feeling you sometimes get when you're home alone? That sudden shiver that races up your spine, making your skin crawl even when you know you're the only one there? It's the kind of feeling that makes you hesitate to cross that dark hallway in your house. Your mind playing tricks on you, warning of unseen dangers lurking in the shadows of the place you call home. I never knew my parents. My grandmother was the only constant presence in my life, a tough woman hardened by years of hard work and the harsh climate of Krasnoyarsk. She, like many women of her time, toiled in one of the area's numerous metallurgical factories. Though she wasn't always around, she cared for me as best she could, even if her love often came with a stern demeanor. With 2 mouths to feed, she often had to leave me in the care of our neighbors for long stretches of time, often returning only to sleep at home. Our neighborhood was composed mostly of factory workers and their families, who lived in small huts that offered little relief from the cold. Our own house was no exception, tucked away on the edge of the community. It was a modest shack of barely 50 square meters. Inside, the walls were painted a weathered yellow, while the floor was covered with wooden planks. Curiously, the exterior was camouflaged by logs, attempting to conceal the concrete beneath. The house wasn't that much by itself, but the patches of trees that surrounded the house left a clear area where the house sat, making it feel like it didn't belong to the city. My grandmother had a peculiar taste in decorating. The outside of our house was adorned with a variety of ornaments and bird sculptures, painted in bright colors. When she decided on a particular decoration, she refused to change it, no matter what. Inside, the walls were adorned with framed photos of unfamiliar faces, intercalated with portraits of unfamiliar people. My grandmother had a habit of collecting these photos and scattering them around the house in a seemingly random fashion. She also had a habit of rearranging furniture every few weeks, which left me perplexed and curious as to her motivations. Whenever I asked her about her frequent rearrangements, her expression would turn somber, silencing any further questions. It was an unspoken rule in our household. Certain questions were best left unanswered. Sometimes my grandmother had no choice but to leave me home alone, mainly because Anna, the neighbor who usually took care of me, couldn't, either for medical or personal reasons. On those days, she would come home from work earlier than usual and seem more exhausted than ever. However, there was a subtle sense of relief in her eyes when I was there, as if she feared something was going to happen to me during those brief hours of solitude. But the worst days were those when my grandmother was not able to get home before sunset. Those days were the ones I dreaded the most. During the day, the small forest surrounding our house was my playground, sometimes even losing track of time until the sun began to set. But when it got dark, the trees would transform into menacing shadows that would cast themselves over the house. Sometimes, when I closed the curtains, an unsettling feeling would come over me. I felt I was being watched by invisible eyes. On rare occasions, I would summon the courage to peek outside and see 2 piercing white orbs fixed to the house. Hastily, I would close the window and crawl into bed, burying myself under the covers and shivering with fear, struggling to stay awake, terrified at the thought of the murmurs returning, piercing through the walls while the presence lurked on the other side of my window, in the distance. Most nights, exhaustion would get the better of me, and I would fall asleep whenever I woke up. Usually in the morning, the sound of wood scraping against the floor would signal that my grandmother was moving the furniture around. Shooted in my room until she was done, listening to the eerie symphony of the wood slowly and leisurely creeping against each other while I waited for her approval to leave the room. During those days when I was confined to my room until my grandmother finished rearranging the furniture, she always seemed to be in a hurry, almost frantic, to get us out of the house. She would quickly hand me over to our neighbor, Anna, and leave me in her care until the next day, appearing extremely tired. Normal days were spent playing with 2 of the neighbor kids, Pavel and Verena. Pavel was one of the few kids I played with when I was little. He never let the stories that were told about our house and my grandmother be a problem for us to become friends. We met playing one day like any other day on the back of the river that crosses the back of our neighborhood. We started a competition to see who was able to roll a stone over the water the most times. We spent hours running up and down, looking at all the possible stones to find the perfect ones that would lead us to victory against each other. I lost the competition that day, but I got the best friendship I could have wished for. We met Varinka 2 years later. Her parents moved to our neighborhood from another nearby city because they got an offer in one of the factories. The one that started talking to her was Pavel, being the sociable child that he was. Both of them became close friends almost immediately. Soon after, I followed Pavel's steps and befriended her. On the days that I spent with Anna, the three of us used to go on our own little adventures that were restricted to meal and snack times, and you must believe that we squeezed out as much time as possible. Our usual routine used to be to build hideouts, climb trees, and play hide and seek in the small forest that wrapped my house. Pavel, Varinka, and I had multiple spots with small hideouts that barely resisted a day or two because of the poor choice of materials that we built them with. But still, there were two that held the most, the treehouse and the cave. The treehouse was the closest one to my house. It consisted of a dead tree that was hollow inside. It was quite small, and the only things that we kept inside the treehouse were some rocks that we used as chairs and a big piece of wood that we used as a table. The area that surrounded the treehouse was quite dense with poor sunlight because of the multiple trees that grew there. Because of the many days we spent there playing, a path was created because of our footsteps, making a small path to the west part of my house. While the treehouse was a 5-minute walk through the forest, the cave was further inside the forest. As the name foreshadowed, the cave was a hole besides a small hill. The cave wasn't much bigger than the tree, but the fact that it was a cave made our minds think that it was for some reason cooler than the treehouse. There was the place that we used to hang out the most whenever we got the chance to go to the forest. The cave was decorated inside as much as a child could. We took some chairs that Pavel found in the dumpster, while Varinka brought some flowers from her garden. And meanwhile, I brought a small bird feeder that my grandmother recently changed for a newer one. Those were the happiest memories that I could remember. Those times when we could play freely without anything that could worry us. But sadly, those days weren't meant to last forever. One day that Anna left me to go to the forest. As usual, Pavel, Varinka, and I met at the river as always, walking while following the water flow towards the forest. We chatted about some nonsense that Pavel used to bring out, laughing, and we walked in the forest, following the small path that we used to go in and out of the forest from the side of the river. As we moved deeper into the forest, an uneasy feeling came over us, overshadowing our carefree chatter. The familiar sights and sounds of the forest seemed different that day, as if the trees themselves were whispering warnings we couldn't decipher. Pavel, Varinka, and I followed the beaten path, our footsteps echoing in the silent forest. But as we approached the clearing where our hideout awaited us, an eerie silence descended, suffocating the once vibrant atmosphere. The air grew heavy with anticipation. An unspoken tension hung over us like a shroud. Arriving at the treehouse, we found it shrouded in darkness and its hollow trunk in eerie silence. The rocks that had served as our seats lay scattered on the forest floor, as if they had been abandoned. Even the dense treetops seemed to retain their usual warmth, casting long shadows that stretched out like accusing fingers. With a nervous glance between us, we continued on, our steps faltering as we approached the cave. But as we drew closer, we realized that the entrance was blocked by fallen debris, as if it had been sealed shut by some unseen force. A chill ran down my spine as I exchanged glances with Pavel and Varinka. What had once been our sanctuary now looked as if an earthquake would have knocked down the entrance. As the first tendrils of fear coiled in our hearts, a distant sound echoed, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a faint whimper, barely louder than the sound of leaves against the wind, but loud enough to startle us all. Varinka, frightened, stood motionless, with a desperate look that didn't focus at nothing in particular, trying to see where such a chilling sound could come from. When I saw Pavel, he was standing before Varinka, holding a stone that he must have picked up from the pile he was standing on while I was looking at the entrance to the cave. And then something started to flow through the rocks. It was a strange liquid that had a carmesy tone that seemed to glow in the shadows, a liquid that appeared to have no visible limits and seemed to come out of nowhere. I didn't notice how much time I spent looking at the red liquid flowing through the rocks when I noticed something. Whatever thing was whimpering, It wasn't outside with us. It was inside the cave. I didn't know what to do. Varinka was already running back to her house, while Pavel was frozen in the same position as he was, looking at the entrance of the cave, but his face didn't seem scared or shocked anymore. Instead, his face seemed like he was hypnotized. He took a step towards the cave. When I realized what I was going to do, I rushed at him, gripping him by the shoulder and shaking him, trying to shake him out of his trance. After a few seconds, Pavel looked around in confusion as the faint whimpers continued to sound behind the rubble, increasingly agonizing but whimpering with the same intensity. When Pavel finally looked at me, the first thing he said was, "Where is Varinka?" "She's gone already," I replied frantically, trying to get him to start moving. Hearing me, he dropped the stone, which splashed some of the strange crimson liquid on our shoes, and ran towards the forest path. While I followed closely behind him, the whimper of the thing could still be heard behind us. After not much time, we arrived at the river where Varinka was sobbing, catching her breath. I turned to see how Pavel was doing. I saw him with an absorbed look, watching closely the trees, almost as if something was talking to him. That night was one of the worst that I have experienced. When my grandmother came home that night, she noticed that something was wrong at the moment that she saw me. "What happened?" she asked with an expression that I had never seen before in her face. It seemed to be a mix of seriousness and worry. I told her about how we had found our hideouts destroyed, the whimper, and the strange substance. Without waiting any longer, she almost jumped and started to search frantically in some drawers, taking out some kind of cross that I had never seen before. It seemed similar to the catalogue course, but in the lower part it was split in half, making it seem like two wooden legs. On all of the surface, different carvings were made. Some of them seemed Russian, some of them were Nordic, some of them were Latin, and a bunch of them I can't even recognize today. She left the cross in the middle of the house and then rushed towards the kitchen, grabbing all the meat that we had on the house and throwing it out. I looked at her with a mix of perplexity and worry, as I didn't understand what she was doing. She took me to the bathroom and started to bathe me, scrubbing my whole body almost as if she were trying to clean out a stain from a new piece of cloth. When she was done, I noticed that my skin was red because of the rubbing. When she was done with me, she took the same ritual with the rest of the house, opening every window, the door, and the cabinets and scrubbing them. I didn't understand what was going on. The house was almost completely dark. Only the light from the lamps that we had and the full moon could be seen in the sky. The air was cold, and I was still wet from the bath. She finished with the house and started to do the same to herself, scrubbing her skin until it became red. The sound of her breathing and the scrubbing was the only thing that could be heard. The forest was in absolute silence. She finished and looked at me. "Now, let's pray," she said with a calm voice, almost too calm, as if her previous panic was never there. We kneeled beside the strange cross and began to pray. The windows and door were still open at this point. Something could be heard outside. As the first words started to come out of our mouths, the whimper appeared softly, as if trying to not make us notice his presence. Word after word, it grew persistent. The moon, covered by a thin layer of clouds, enveloped our home with eerie shadows. Our prayers grew in intensity, trying to match the whimper, as if we were trying to cover it with our own voice. Then, suddenly, nothing. I didn't feel cold or warmth. I didn't feel my hand brushing against my grandmother's hand, the numbness in my knees from kneeling, the cold of the night against my skin, just the whimpering, weak, almost pleasant and sweet, like a mother's call or like the sun against your skin on a spring evening. I wanted to answer him, to go to him, to let myself go. A pull. When I came to my senses, I was on the porch. As I looked around frantically, I saw my grandmother pulling me, with a terror I could never have imagined to have seen on her face. Then I looked to where her gaze was fixed. Slowly, as I gazed through those bird ornamentations that I had become so used to seeing, I looked towards the trees, Orbs, dozens. No, hundreds of them looking at us. I rushed inside in an instant, catching my grandmother by surprise. Stuttering, she kept praying, leaving the door still open. Once again, we knelt. Over the next few hours, it tried to pull me back to him countless times. I was about to give in again on a couple of occasions, but the horror on my grandmother's face anchored me to the ground in front of the cross. At one point in time, the night began to fade, leaving behind its shadows, and with it, those observant orbs, waiting for a mistake to jump towards us, changing its place with a tenuous golden light, which with its arrival marked the end of the nightmare of that night. With the whimpering becoming weaker and weaker, my eyes closed with exhaustion, letting me drift off into a peaceful sleep. Knox woke me up a few hours later. It seemed frantic. I was in bed in my pajamas, disoriented by the events of the previous night. I stood up suddenly, my heart pounding against my chest at the sudden knocking on the front door. I got up to see who was banging on the front door. "Yakov!" Someone screamed on the other side of the door with an anguished voice. "Yakov, please open the door." I ran towards the door, opening it as I recognized the voice on the other side. It was the voice of Anna. What happened? Anna? In a scared tone, I was able to ask her. It was an unusual situation. Anna didn't like to get too close to my house, so seeing her here on the porch was something that I didn't expect at all. "Pavel," she was able to tell, under a sigh. "Pavel is lost." My world started to shatter as Anna was able to say those words. She continued talking, asking me questions frantically, but my mind wasn't there. "Do you know where he is? Did he by any chance go to your house the last night?" Anna said. Whimpers. I thought out loud. Anna tried to speak. "What?" Before she could even finish what she was saying, I started to run, barefoot. I ran faster than I even imagined that I could. The adrenaline pumping in my veins kept the pain away from my feet. I ran. I really ran, as fast as I could. I really tried. When I arrived at the cave, it was too late. The carmesy substance was only touching the stones, almost as if avoiding the ground. Once I looked up, I saw an entrance. For some reason, a hole could be seen in the middle of the debris. "Pavel!" I cried out, my voice trembling with fear and desperation. But there was no response. I tried to move the fallen debris that was blocking the entrance with trembling hands, but it was too heavy and firmly wedged in place. Tears began to fall as I realized the horrifying truth. Pavel was trapped inside the cave, cut off from the outside world by a rubble wall. Panic gripped my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs as I struggled to make sense of the situation. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts and fears, each one more terrifying than the last. What if Pavel was hurt? What if he was alone and scared? What if he wasn't alone? With trembling limbs, I tried to force my way into the cave, clawing at the rocks with desperate urgency. But no matter how hard I tried, the debris refused to budge, despite my desperate efforts. Time seemed to stretch into eternity as I stood there, helpless and alone, with the sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. The forest around me was silent, as if it were waiting for the unthinkable. And then, from deep within the cave, I heard it, a faint whimper, barely audible above my own heartbeat. It was Pavel's voice, weak and muffled, but unmistakably him. "Pavel. Oh God. I'm here," I called out to him, my voice breaking with terror, but there was no answer. I realized with a sinking feeling in my stomach that Pavel was out of reach, trapped in a prison of stone and darkness with whatever called him to enter the cave. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I collapsed on the ground, overcome by grief and despair. The weight of the situation pressed down on me like a physical force, crushing me under its unbearable weight. In that moment, I felt completely alone, like a small, insignificant speck in the vastness of the universe. And as I gazed up at the sky, my vision blurred with tears. I couldn't help but wonder if anyone would ever find Pavel, or if anyone would ever know what had happened to him. But deep down, I knew the truth. Pavel was lost, swallowed up by the darkness of the cave, trapped with the thing that whimpered, and there was nothing I could do to save him. And as I sat there, alone in the forest, I saw the last stones being pulled by the strange carmesy liquid, locking them in their final place, and with them silencing Pavel to the outside world. Story 6. In the darkness. It was 2 a.m. I was tired and beat from work. I looked at my bed and wanted to put my head down. I couldn't yet. A large sigh erupted from me as I walked to the kitchen and made my food. I decided on some bulldog and mayo for a quick, easy meal. After cleaning up and putting my dishes in the sink, I wandered back to my room and flipped onto the bed without kicking off my shoes or changing. As my head touched the pillow, I was out. I felt something was off and bolted awake. It was pitch black. I noticed I was not in my room, and wherever I was, it was not home. I stood up, thankful I fell asleep with my shoes on. I blinked and took a breath. Wherever I was, there was no light, and it was cold and wet. A shiver ran up my spine and panic. I started to grope for a wall and get my bearings. I finally found a wall and got a sigh of relief. I planted my hand on it and started to walk. As I traced the wall, a small flicker of light started towards me. I wanted to scream for help, but decided to stay quiet. Could this be the person who took me? Was I taken? If I scream, will they chase me down? Fear as my hair started to stand on end. A booming voice yelled at me. Are you lost? Fear, cold sweats, and a panic attack. Do I answer? Should I stay quiet? What do I do? I make up my mind and yell back. I don't know. I don't even know where I am. As I yelled, the light ran at me, frozen to the spot. Unable to move, it was in front of me within seconds. I could see what was holding the light, and it was terrible. A large creature with a mouth filled with needled teeth. No eyes, stood about 7 feet tall. The blood drained from my face. Screaming, "Stay silent, stay silent." The creature spoke. Well, now you are new, or you must be terrified. As it touched, its low row of teeth, almost as holding its chin in thought. He spoke again. We'll miss you are in the world of darkness. Those that fall down here all take a shape that is most terrifying. Only way to see a person for who they are is to find your light. Be glad I found you first, because there are real monsters down here, and without your light, you will never know who is friend or foe. It is strange, though. You don't seem to be taking a form of a monster without that light. Strange, very strange. We'll miss if you will follow me. I can take you to where you can find your light. Without an answer, the creature started to walk away, not knowing if it was safe. I chose to walk a few paces behind the creature. Don't know if it would do me any good with how fast they moved. I was on high alert during our walk. Small lights popped up, then would fade out of view. Questions swimming in my head. I didn't take a shape or form. What is this light? Is this a trap? Lost in thought, I didn't notice that the creature froze, and I walked right into the back of it, falling to the ground. A grunt and a shh, don't move. I stopped from getting up and held my breath. Before I knew it, I was picked up like a feather, and he started running with me. As I was held close, the creature's image faded. It was a man with black hair, blue eyes, and was actually not that tall but athletic. As the light was pressed between us, I could see the fear on his face. He was not lying, and now I was glad I was found by him, instead of whatever was chasing us now. He looked down at my face, noticing I could see him and not his form. Surprise crossed his face. As he dodged around a corner, we skidded to a stop near a cove and ducked in. It was tight fit. He was breathing hard and still holding me like a sack of potatoes. Something is not right. How can you not have a form and see me without a light? That makes no sense. What are you? I stammered, I'm just a regular human. I got off work, I laid in bed and then woke up here. What else do you want from me? I am scared. You told me I entered the darkness, and I am seeing monsters who could probably not be monsters. I saw you as one, and now you're a man. What the fuck do you think? I don't have a damn clue. Apparently I need this light. I am freaking out, and you pick me up like a sack of potatoes and run, and I have no clue what's chasing us. I am yelling and shaking in his arms. He turns pale, trying to shush me. Then I see it. A beast running to the cove we are in, smashing against it, claws ripping and tearing through the cove. It is too large to enter. He starts to push down the cove with me pushed against him. As he desperately tries to squeeze us down further, I feel it. The claws are like razor blades. It cuts my shoulder and a back. I hear a gasp escape me. It hurts as blood spills down. He looks at me, fear and panic. He is hurt as well. This large beast is like a cat at a mouse hold. It's got feathers around its neck-needled teeth. It's like a feathered cat with glowing blood eyes. It mostly has feathers around its ankles and neck and tufts on its ears. It is ungodly ugly. The sounds it makes are bone-chilling. We are pressed together, bleeding as the claws reach and scratches at us. I finally get leverage and almost scream as I push myself out of his arms and grab him by his shirt and pull us forward. We get further out of reach. It's small, but I am small, so I crouch down and start to cry and beg, why, what did I do? He looks at me and slides down the wall next to me. He hurt bad. You're hurt, he says to me. I look at him and say, well, you are as well. Please explain what's going on. He sighed. Okay, the darkness is where people are sent for trail. Lost souls, coma patients. They are held for accountability, or they are here because they have fallen through. People take on the form closest to their sins. Each person has their own light, and many wander the darkness. Those who are here and never make it through become those monsters because they give up. You seem to take no form, see us without the light. I don't think you belong here. I don't think I belong either. If you have a form, your form looked like a giant walking leech before I could see you. You terrified me. So if people take the closest form to their sins, would that mean you took what didn't belong to you? He looked down. He spoke, I am ashamed. Yes, I took and caused misery on those around me because of my addiction. It caused me to fall into a coma. Well, here I started helping others like me find their light. I am ashamed of my actions. Well, I was living and I take accountability for what I did. I have my light, but I don't feel like I deserve freedom because of the pain and misery I caused. I looked at him. I started to rip my shirt and make a wrap for his arm. He stared and went to stop me, but as he reached, I took his arm and wrapped his arm up. I don't think you should stay here. You seem to be truly sorry, and you helped me not knowing if I was going to be evil or harm you. You protected me and got hurt for me. And that monster is a monster through and through. They deserve to be here, because from what I can tell is they were a predator in life, and always will be, and they enjoyed making us suffer. I don't know if I have a sin. I have always tried to be kind and compassionate to everyone. My biggest weakness is that I care too much and let people take advantage, and I some days wonder if I even deserve to live. I struggle every day. He looked at my wounds and looked at his bandaged arm, his eyes downcast, looking at the ground. As he began to speak, a clicking and skittering noise started to come down the cove. He froze, shooting upright, grabbing me by the hand and pulling me down the hallway. I looked back and saw a humanoid centipede gripping the wall and moving swiftly to us. As we squeezed and moved as fast as we could, we finally popped out of the cove into a big space. I saw a child crying, holding a teddy bear, crying for their mother, begging them to save them. Without thinking, I shook my hand free, darting to the child, picking them up, and then continued to run. He looked at me as if I had done something horrible. We finally found a place and hid. The child was quiet in my arms. He was about to start yelling. Then the child looked up at me. I could see they were scared, but as they looked at me, a smile crossed their face. The child whispered, "Thank you." As I hugged them tight, they started to fade. He stood frozen as I hugged the child again, wishing them safety and peace. He glared at me. "What were you thinking?" he screamed at me. I babbled, well, they were crying for their mum, and I couldn't run knowing that creature would have hurt them. It was just instinct to protect them, and I didn't know. He looked stunned. "That was a child you grabbed." I didn't see it as a child. It looked like a statue. "You really can see us. You just set a lost child free." "I'm sorry for yelling." He saw my wounds were worse. He started to tear cloth strips from his shirt. He bandaged my arm. He was lost on how to care for the one on my back. I smiled at him. He was frustrated. I touched his hand and said, "You need to move on. You can't stay here forever. You have atoned from what you have told me." I gave him a hug. "Please move forward." He started to fade. tears in his eyes. What about you? Well, come find me in the waking world. When you wake up and see. I sat there alone. As all the monsters started to close in, I sat there smiling. At least I could get those who deserved to be free out. Tears swelled up in my eyes. I am all alone again in the darkness with the monsters. As they lunged for me, I could hear an alarm going off. I shoot up, feeling more exhausted and in pain. I look at my arm and there is a cloth bandage. There is blood on my bed and I am filthy. My back screams at me. I look around and see that I am home. I drag myself to my alarm and turn it off. I go to the bathroom and look at myself. Was it a dream, I question? I look at the bandage and wounds. I put it to the side and get into the shower. As I wash, my doorbell rings. I finish cleaning myself and grab a towel. Rushing to the door, I nearly trip and slam face first into the door. I open the door to see the man from my dream or not dream. Well, looks like I found you. He chuckles. He looks at me and sees I have wounds and me holding the bandage from the dream. He turns pale. That's not possible. You can't physically enter the darkness. You shouldn't have anything from the darkness when you come back. I stood frozen and scared. Had I really fallen out of reality, and would I be dead now if I had not somehow slipped back to reality? Story 7. Big Softy. I had a rough time as a kid. I suffered from both hemangiomas and spotty hair loss, two conditions that would go away the closer I got to my teenage years. But for those first few years, I was a social pariah. I looked strange, which was enough to draw unwanted attention. Some kids thought I had a kind of mange, while others just didn't like to look at me. My parents didn't make it easier for me, forcing me to bring various creams that I had to apply during school hours. I ended up trying to make my own fun. I made up my own friends in my head, and I played a lot of board games on my own. My parents were going through a divorce, and both swore off having any more children, so I ended up an only child. Most of my made-up friends were just a plaything. I could tell it was all just for fun, and that they weren't real. I didn't see them or hear them. I made up little stories in my head, trying to imagine what they would do if they were there. I could get really into it. I had this one imaginary friend who always tried to cheat in games, so when I played with him at the table, I'd move the pieces in a way he would, and thus cheat. Another friend was obsessed with lemonade, so I always brought an extra glass for him. When I was 7 years old, there was a new friend. This one was different. I could really see him. I knew he was just as fake as the rest of them, as he only appeared when I was alone and playing. But he was strange. I hadn't imagined him for a specific purpose. I didn't come up with a name for him. I didn't know anything about him. Even if I would pretend not to know the cheater and the lemonade enthusiast to drive conversation, this one was a genuine mystery. He was scary. He looked like a person, but sort of stretched, at least 7 feet tall. Pale, flaking, grey skin. He was super thin and had this sort of hanging face, like his skin was slouching. It reminded me of a wet towel hanging off a rack. And his eyes, well, they were empty. There was nothing there. He was super quiet and rarely moved. I'd usually forget he was even there, unless he made his little sound, a sort of teeth chatter. It was like a tick. Sometimes a single click. Other times he'd just stand there, chattering excitedly. Clack, clack, clack. At first, I just asked him to go away. He didn't talk, and he didn't answer any questions. No matter what I played, he refused to participate, or even acknowledge me. He just wanted to be there. Most of the time, he was a nuisance. He'd scare me. I'd wake up to that noise of chattering teeth at night, or it'd click right next to my ear when I played with my board games. Over time, it went from scary to frustrating. He was just being a bother. But there was that time in middle school that changed the way I viewed him. There was a new kid in school who was an infamous bully. Let's call him Ian. He'd been moved from another school where he'd been a menace. No one really knew what to do with him, so they just sort of moved him around. And now it was our turn to deal with him. And of course, I was a clear target. Ian started calling me Scabs, and it kind of caught on. The sick dog of the class now had a name that the others clung to, and it wasn't a good one. But it didn't end there. One day after school, he took things too far, spurred on by cheers and laughter from my classmates. I was beaten bloody. While I was beaten, the others went inside to get some scissors. They were going to cut my mangy hair. When it was just me and the Ian, I heard that teeth chattering noise again. I could see the strange figure in the background. My first thought was that he was there to mock me too. But, to my surprise, it had other plans. It leaned in, unhinged its massive jaw, and took a bite out of Ian's ear, tearing it in half. It was instant pandemonium. Ian turned around, not looking at me, but straight at his assailant. He could see him too, blood and screams, panic. Ian scrambled like a scared dog, tripping over his own legs to get away. The others came running back out, but as they saw what had happened, they all had a collective gasp. Seeing them step back was empowering. They turned and ran, screaming and pointing. They hadn't seen what Ian and I had. They thought I'd done it. "He took his ear," they shrieked. "He took it. He took Ian's ear." The kids ran. They ran like their heads were on fire. I sat there for a moment, my body pulsing with bruises and shock. The strange creature approached me. Its teeth had stopped chattering, replaced with chewing slowly, savoring a meal. For all the help it had given me, this was grotesque. My adrenaline had spiked, and I just said the first thing that came to mind. Maybe it didn't really want to hurt me. Maybe it was there for some other reason. Either way, I said what I said. "You're just a big softy, aren't you?" I sniffled. You're a big softy." "By GSOFTY, it wheezed back. It was less of a voice and more of a throbbing wind. His lips didn't move. "BIGSOFTY, it continued. "AM. "Yeah, you are." I nodded. "That's you." It leaned in close, inspecting me. It didn't breathe. "NAME, it hissed. "FREE. I stared into those hollow sockets, waiting for something to happen. A smile, a breath, anything, but no. I blinked, and Big Softy was no longer there. Sometimes violence solves things. While that brawl didn't make me popular, it stopped kids from teasing me. Classmates began using my regular name again. Sure, there were still whispers and the occasional side-eye, but that was still an immense improvement. No one spoke about that fight, though. I didn't want to get in trouble for the ear, and they didn't want to get in trouble for bullying me, so we kept it to ourselves and never spoke of it again. Ian seemed fine with sitting quietly and not talking to anyone about it. He'd changed. And Big Softy, well, he sort of disappeared. It's like he'd done his job and went on his merry way. For a couple of years that followed, I thought he just might have been a figment of my imagination. Maybe I was the one who really bit Ian, and this whole thing was just a way to cope with that trauma. It had to be something of the sort. Imaginary friends don't affect the real world. Then again, giving him a name, even a nickname, seemed to have encouraged him. Or something worse. Most of my afflictions cleared up in high school, and I found a solid group of like-minded youths. Over time, all little dream friends faded from memory. The one who cheated, the one who loved lemonade, 100 others who I can't even remember. The way they looked, the way they sounded, their names and quirks, they all went away. But Big Softy stayed on my mind, realer than any of them. The hollow eyes, the chattering teeth. It was strange how the most horrifying of all my imaginary friends turned out to be the one who stuck around the longest. But time passes. High school turned to college. College turned to work. And by the time I was 27, I had a pretty cozy life going. But even then, despite not having seen or heard that childhood friend of mine, Big Softy still drifted into my dreams every now and then. I wish I could end the story here. It'd just be a strange anecdote about something that happened to me as a kid. Sadly, that's not the case. What began as an unusual childhood curiosity turned into a waking nightmare. Back in 2019, I was in a pretty good place. I was 6 months into a promotion that added a flat 15% to my salary. And I was finally getting back into dating after a messy breakup a couple of months earlier. Nothing serious, but it felt good to shake off the cobwebs. I was coming home from a long day of overtime and had to stop for gas. Nothing I hadn't done 100 times before. I got myself a Slim Jim and told the long-haired man behind the counter that I wanted $30 on pump 2. I handed over my card and checked my phone for a moment. Clack. Teeth. Turning around, nothing. I could feel my pulse spiking for no apparent reason. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. The overhead lights, the faint whiff of gasoline. That one noise brought me straight back to middle school. It sent this cold spike straight into my head, as if I could picture that hollowed-out face in front of me. I snapped out of it with a beep from the cash register. I thanked the cashier and headed for the door. Just before I left, I turned back to them. "Excuse me, but did you hear something strange just now?" "No." "Oh, can't say I did. Sorry." "Did you click your tongue or something?" "Can't say I did, sir." I nodded. Of course they didn't. The same sensation came back to me on 4 different occasions. Once when I was closing the blinds in my bedroom, once when getting the mail at work, another time when stuck in traffic, and once when I was about to answer a phone call. I ended up missing it. It was such a strange reminder. It had come out of nowhere, and now it was starting to become a daily annoyance. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. There wasn't really a direction. It was just like, in my head, it was there, everywhere, nowhere, and inside. Clack. And yet, Big Softy was yet to be seen. I was having trouble focusing on work. I couldn't push my intrusive thoughts out, and I ended up doing some digging on social media, looking up old acquaintances from school, folks I hadn't seen or heard from in years. Some had started families. Others had moved far away for work or studies. There were only a handful of them still left in Minnesota. One face stood out to me, though. Ian. Turns out, he was still around. The moment I got home from work, I went straight to my computer. I looked up Ian on some of the more common social media sites. The man had no privacy settings. Most of it was just nonsense. Pictures of him having beers with the boys. A couple of nice cars. Group pictures of random people with generic nicknames. This was a man that wanted to express nothing more than being Han Friday blessed. But looking a little closer, there were a few cracks in the facade. For example, there were a couple more recent comments he'd made to a few friends of his. "God doesn't just send angels to protect you," he said in one post. "Sometimes he sends demons to test you." Looking a bit closer revealed a lot more pain than was readily apparent. Ian was taking medication for schizophrenia. He was overcoming a drinking problem. He seemed to constantly be bouncing between complete disregard for others and hysterical regret for his actions. He could be fighting for forgiveness in one post and bragging about stealing from work in the next. The man was a mess, a complete mess, and that half-missing ear of his didn't do him any favors, no matter how many tattoos he put on his neck to divert the attention. But one particular post caught my attention. He was discussing lifestyle challenges with a local youth pastor, an old acquaintance we had in common, and they were at a disagreement. Ian spat out, "I don't deny my goddamn problems. I know what they look like. I know their names. I see their teeth. See their teeth. Huh." Furthermore, no one seemed to have seen him for a while. For all intents and purposes, Ian had sort of fallen off the face of the earth, leaving behind one last cryptic post. "It's getting too real," the post read. "It's too close." And with that, he'd posted nothing more. I checked the dates, my notes, and made some deductions. That final post of his was written the same day I first started hearing the teeth chattering noise again. That couldn't be a coincidence. It just couldn't. I didn't find out anything else about him, and the sound of teeth chattering with horrible timing was getting worse. Once, I had to pull over in traffic to stop my heart from racing. I could have sworn I saw that hollowed-out face in my rear-view mirror. I was so frustrated that I smacked my hands on my dashboard so hard I got a bruise. By the time I got home, I was nervous and stressed. I threw off my jacket, stormed into the kitchen, and cracked open a Coke. I slammed the door shut so hard, I knocked one of the fridge magnets to the floor. A little blue sunflower. It came with the place. Leaning back against the fridge, my heart skipped a beat. Big Softy was right there, just a few feet away, looking right at me. Clack, clack, clack. I dropped my can of Coke. As it hit the floor, I blinked. In the next moment, I was alone again. Clutching my chest, I picked the can up. I wiped up the spill with a couple of paper towels, trying my best to calm down. This was getting out of hand. I hadn't regained my composure before there was another sound, a knock on the door. It surprised me. I wasn't expecting company. I lumbered over to the door, flustered and shaky. I put my hand on the handle, then stopped. Maybe there was a reason I'd seen that thing. Maybe it wasn't just a psychosis. What if it meant something? Could it have something to do with whoever, or whatever, was on the other side of the door? "I can shoot you through the door," a muffled voice said. "Open." I froze, one hand on the door handle, another hand on my phone. I was stuck. I couldn't make myself move. "I won't ask again. Open." I didn't know what to say. I turned the handle and carefully stepped back. Ian. He looked like he'd gone through hell to get there. Unwashed hair, unkempt beard, and a shiny new handgun pointed at me. His hands were shaking. He wasn't kidding around. His fingers trembled. He was trying to pull the trigger. "Ian?" I said, reflexively. What are you?" "Shut up." He spat. "Just shut up." He raised the handgun, staring me down. The sound of his own name shook him. "It has to end. I can't." His aim faltered. He looked away. A second later, he pushed me back and entered my apartment, closing the door behind him. He led me into the kitchen. There were still wet paper towels on the floor from my spilled drink. "Sit down," he said, pointing to a chair. "Keep your hands on the table." I did as he said. There was a sudden quiet between us, as if he hadn't planned this far. There was a clear uncertainty to his actions, which just made it worse. I couldn't tell what he'd do next. "I need you to make it stop," he said. "It has to stop. It has to. I can't just..." "Don't tell me you can't." He raised his gun, stepping closer. My whole body felt cooler as blood rushed to my arms and legs. "Don't you tell me that," he repeated. "Now make it stop." Before I got a chance to say or do anything, he sat down across from me, gun still pointed in my direction. One wrong move, a twitch, anything, and it'd be over. I almost forgot to breathe. "I know it's yours. It's been yours for always," he continued, scratching his hair, "but it's too much. It's gone too far. So, okay." I tried to collect my thoughts. "You're talking about him, with the teeth." "Don't act like you don't know his fucking name," Ian groaned. "Don't you fucking dare." We looked at one another and said it, in unison. "Big Softy." The moment we said it, I could see him emerging from the shadows in the back of the kitchen. I tried my best not to gasp, or look his way. "He's in my head every night. I hear him, all the time," Ian continued. "That fucking click-clacking, right in my ear. Sometimes in my face, like he wants to take a bite." "I'm not controlling that," I said, carefully picking my words. "I haven't seen him in decades." "You even know how bad you fucked up?" he said, squinting with disbelief. "You named it. That's all they need to go off." They need a name. They need to be made real. And you... He raised his gun, growing more determined by the second. You made him real. We moved, this time to the bathroom. I didn't have a say in the matter. Having a gun pointed straight at me. Somewhere off in the background, I could see the vague shape of Big Softy, moving soundlessly from one room to another. I can't control it, I said. I have nothing to... I don't care. But this is pointless. There's nothing. I don't care. If you go away, his fucking name goes away. You don't know that. I was pushed through the bathroom door and to the back of my shower. I tripped, coming down hard on my tailbone. The ceramic tiles felt icy cold against my sweaty palms, and I could smell a bit of chlorine from the cleaning supplies. He raised his gun. This was it. Big Softy, I said. That's all I did. I called it a goddamn nickname. I don't deserve to die for that. Ian's resolve faltered. He scratched his head again, groaning, but more so. I could see Big Softy just outside the room. Was he getting closer? Big Softy, I said again, my eyes darting to the door. I was a scared kid. It just slipped out. Don't you dare put this on me, he said. Don't you dare. I observed the creature. It was approaching. Every time I said its name, it got a little closer. Looking Ian dead in the eye, I took a deep breath. This was it. Big Softy, I said. Big Softy, Big Softy. What the hell are... I kept repeating it, over and over and over. It might do something, it might not. Either way, I had to try. By the sixth time I said it. That enormous, looming creature was inches behind Ian. But more so, it was changing. Not a lot, but enough for me to notice. It was smiling. Ian raised his gun at me and pulled the trigger. At the same time, I said the name for a seventh and final time. The shot went wild as an unhinged jaw came down on Ian's shoulder. There was a scream, a spurt of blood on the bathroom mirror, a flailing arm hitting the light switch, turning a gruesome scene into a shadow theater. Impossibly thin hands wrapping around a throat, twisting his neck like a toothpaste cap, crunching, ripping, chewing, teeth, 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 clack, clack, clack. Laughter, otherworldly, ethereal laughter. I have no idea how long it went on. Ian didn't even have time to beg. The handgun clattered to the ground. It was just me and this thing, alone in a dark bathroom. I couldn't speak. I just curled up into a ball and tried my best to ignore the viscera running into the drain next to me. There was a slight creaking sound as old knees bent, a hot breath on my face. Big Softy could breathe, it seemed. Nice name, it said. The voice was different, real, tangible. I could hear vibrations in his throat. This was no longer a figment of my imagination. Going, it continued. Bye. I could hear something getting dragged out of the apartment. I heard doors open and close, and after God knows how long, I realized I was sitting there, shaking like a dry leaf in the wind. My stomach turned at the idea of turning on the light, but I had to. I got up and reached for the light switch, almost tripping on the handgun, and something slippery clinging to it. Fingers. I flipped the switch, and I broke. I won't go into detail what I saw. Most of the body was gone. Not all of it, but most of it. There was a blood trail leading into the hallway, then disappearing just as it reached the front door. I'd brought that thing into the world. I'd named it, I'd reinforced it, I'd believed it, called out to it, I'd made it real. All it had to do was answer. You can't unlearn something, and even if I could, I think it's too late. I think Big Softy got just enough of what he needed to become something else entirely. He took a life, and now he's got one of his own. Maybe we still have some kind of connection, I don't know. I think we do, or else he might have just killed me too, right then and there. Then again, there's no way to tell. I've obsessed over this for years, looking through articles about mentions of Ian. There were no search parties, no one came looking. Even the people who missed him were reluctant to work with the police, and with his history of schizophrenia, there was a higher likelihood of him just doing something he shouldn't. But I knew better. Ian hadn't been schizophrenic. Big Softy had stuck to him and just tortured him for God knows how long. Decades. Looking back at it, I think that was the plan all along. To drive Ian to a point where he would try to kill me. It is in their final moments that a person gets truly desperate, and that's what I felt on that floor. Desperation. I reached out to whoever would answer, and I couldn't fathom the consequences. He's out there, right now. He probably looks like us, walks like us, and sounds like us, but wherever he is and whatever he does, I don't want a part of it. I don't know what to say, but if you meet a strangely tall man who does that thing with his teeth, just know that there might be more to him, a lot more. He's more than just a big softy. Story 8. I was almost drowned by a film. I was at the HRFY. It's the secret horror movie festival where something genuinely fucked happens every year. And I mean every year. Like, there are some screenings that unleash hordes of bats while the movie is playing. You're free to leave whenever you want, but the movie will still play for 2 hours and 15 minutes. Other screenings hire actors to turn at you and scream at some point in the movie. You have no idea when, or how many times. It's a festival where the word illegal can't even begin to describe what happens. You're forced to sign an NDA if you attend, and you'd only attend if you were a young, stupid edgelord like me who was trying to prove he was hardcore to his friends. Trust me, do not go. You have nothing to prove to anyone. Don't be stupid. If you really want to know what attending HRFY is like, I'll be quick and summarize the one screening I went to. It was the 20th anniversary, and I was lucky enough to get in. I had signed up on the HRRFY dark web forum, where I'm pretty sure my identity may have been stolen. But what can you do? Through a series of cryptic forum DMs, I solved a sequence of riddles and was entered in the lottery for a HRFY entry. Lady Luck took a shine to me, because one day in my mailbox, I received a physical ticket. I had done it. I was going. The actual ticket was a black USB key that announced the location of the festival the night before, which I won't disclose here, otherwise I may be hunted. I was pretty much forced to pay for a very expensive flight in order for me to make it on time. You see, to prevent getting shut down, the location of HRFY changes every year. It's always a small town you've never heard of, where the authorities can't catch on to what's happening until it's well over. Upon arrival, I had to pick between 3 secretly participating theaters. Based on title alone, I decided to go see Many Drownings, directed by Alexander Gowansky, though that might have been a pseudonym. It was in the theater that was furthest away from the downtown core, which meant it was likely the one where the craziest shit was bound to happen. That's what I came here for, right? I lined up a solid 2 hours before the screening like everyone else. The entire line was jittering, just vibrating with excited 20-somethings. Rumors flew left and right. I heard they're going to force everyone to take acid. I heard an actor's gonna run in and shotgun the ceiling. I heard they're going to disappear like 4 more people this year. At this screening, each year people disappeared, and each year the same people were found. And yes, this is the worst part. And why should never, ever go to this event? Again, I will repeat myself. Do not go. No one has ever truly gone missing at HRFY in any legal or physical sense, because every missing person always shows up a day later, convinced that they are fine, refusing to elaborate further. The reason they can't talk is because of the intense NDAs attendees sign. If anything were to leak, they'd be dead. As a result, there are some small support groups for people who have family members who had gone to HRRFY and came back irrevocably changed after being found. These few unlucky people lose all semblance of personality. They don't want interviews, or help, or therapy, or contact of any kind. And they never, ever want to talk about what they saw. Some HRRFY fans think that these found people were body snatched, cloned in a lab or replaced by a cyborg, or something stupid like that. But I think there's a far simpler explanation. The found are still the same people. They're just terrified. They got shaken by something that shattered the foundation of their mind, body and soul. They got too scared. They got horrified. I should mention I had a cough the day I went, and I was worried my sickly appearance might give me trouble at the airport. So I invested in an intense double N95 mask, which I wore for the whole flight, and continued to wear even at the screening of many drownings. It made my face hot and uncomfortable, but it still didn't stop me from yelling, "Excuse me, excuse me," as I ran to snag a seat in the back of the theatre. I always preferred sitting in the far back. You get a good view of the whole screen, and a good view of the whole audience. Beside me sat a big dude named Sylvester, who apparently flew all the way from Australia to attend HRRFY. Worth the full 17 hours, mate. It's gonna be epic. He dropped a massive camping backpack beside me, which I assume contained all of his luggage. The lights dimmed, and the production company logos started to play. The whispering, giggling, and suspense all stacked upon each other to create an electric feeling in the air. I was giddy. It's like the entire audience was embarking on a massive roller coaster. The anticipation was the best part for sure. It might have been the only good part. Then the movie started. It was a wide shot of a grey, stormy sea. The waves were massive, and the thunderclouds were looming. There was no land visible in any direction. All we could hear was the sound of waves foaming, swirling, and crashing over and over. Lightning crackled. Rain poured. The camera held perfectly still over this storm, as if it was mounted on a perfectly hovering drone. A drone so resilient that it didn't waver at all. I thought it had to be CGI. The shot held like this for the next few moments. Everyone sat glued to their seats. Everyone was thinking the same thing. What's going to happen? How are they going to scare us? People chuckled. People cheered. People wanted to tease whatever was going to happen already. But nothing did. 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes went by without any change. People started snoring. I looked beside me and saw that Sylvester, the most excited audience member of them all, had fallen totally asleep. The jet lag must have gotten to him. Then I peered beyond the rest of the audience members and saw other people snoozing too. Heads were keeled over. Some people were curled in their seats. Some had even spilled out into the aisle and were dozing on the floor. I looked above the bright screen at the huge vents in the corner of the theatre. I saw a faint white gas emerging from the vents. Holy shit, what have we been breathing? I tightened the straps on my N95 mask and made my breathing shallower. The gas must have been pumping since the opening credits, because how else would an audience of 200 people all fall asleep? As I moved my hand through the air in front of me, I could sense the thickness. It was definitely hazier than usual. I took the scarf off my neck and wrapped it around my mouth as well. Then I spotted movement in front of the screen. It was a tall blonde man, wearing a black trench coat and military-grade gas mask. Beside him arrived 6 hazmat suits, who started pointing at various audience members. I slunk in my chair, pretending to sleep like everyone else. 2 hazmats walked over to the front row and picked out a sleeping guy in flannel. They lifted flannel up, under the armpits and by his ankles, carrying him between them both like a hammock. The hazmats walked back up to the stage, where the blonde leader inspected the flannel man and tapped his head. Something was approved. The hazmats began to swing flannel back and forth, as if they were getting ready to toss him, despite their masks. I could hear a very muffled, very distant countdown. 3, 2, 1. The flannel audience member was tossed into the screen. I literally watched him fly into the image of stormy waves and fall into them. The flannel man sank into the grey water like a rock, leaving a few bubbles and foam. A wave came crashing down. All trace of him was gone. What the fuck? All 6 hazmats began grabbing more audience members with much more urgency. It became a minute-long process where they would pick the sleeping person up, bring them beside the screen, and then swing-toss them into it. How was this possible? I turned slightly to see if there was a projector above me, and realized there was none, which meant maybe there was no screen on stage, which meant maybe it was a portal. I tried to wake Sylvester by shaking him. I pinched his leg and arm a bunch. He was out cold. The hazmat started grabbing audience members from the middle rows now. They were emptying the whole theater. What the hell was I supposed to do? I waited until they grabbed another batch, only a few rows down from me. When all hazmats had their backs turned, I broke into a run. With my left arm, I tightly gripped my mask and scarf against my face, while my right arm vaulted me over seat after seat. I had never breathed so hard, through so much fabric in my life. The hazmats all turned to me. Hey! Hey! But their hands were full with their next victims. I ran all the way down the aisle, to the big exit sign on the left. My heartbeat filled my head. My plan was to drop-kick through the exit door. I imagined myself breaking through like some flying gazelle. I jumped. I angled my kick. It might as well have been a brick wall. I fell ass first to the ground, followed by my head. Of course the door was locked. Through a muffled mask, I heard a sneering scoff. "Where do you think you're going?" Above me stood the one wearing a trench coat. I could see his piercing grey eyes through his gas mask. I rolled aside and tried to run by him. He lifted a foot and tripped me without effort. My forehead bashed into an empty seat. It dazed me. The blonde leader bent down and grabbed me by the neck, tearing away my scarf and mask. No. No! A sweet, ether-like smell filled my nostrils. I did my best to hold my breath, but I could already feel myself getting lightheaded. The other hazmats joined in, grabbing me from all sides. Even if I had the strength to struggle, there was no escape now. Above me, all I could see was the dark theater ceiling and some of the light behind me from the cinema screen. 3, 2, no, please, don't do the splash. I was plunged deep into cold, wet chaos. My head was completely underwater, gagging, bubbles, spinning. I fought for dear life, dog paddling like a maniac, churning, freezing, panic. For a second, my head popped above the water. I inhaled all the air my lungs could muster. I stared across a vast, violent ocean. An enormous 30-foot wave came in my direction. My whole body lifted higher and higher as the wave approached. I did my best to tread water. It seemed to be working. Then a series of smaller waves arrived and smacked my chest. Splash. Spinning, kicking, flipping. My view alternated between the pitch-dark ocean beneath me and the moonlit night sky above. Again I swam to the surface, popped my head out, ravenously sucked in air. There was a small lull in the water. Around me I now registered the other theater-goers. Most of them were lying face down or sinking, but a few were flapping about like me, fighting for their life. And above all of us, a floating white shape. It was painfully bright. I had to lift one hand to look at it. My jaw dropped. It was the movie screen, hanging completely still in the air. It showed a dark, empty theater, the exact same theater we all occupied moments ago. It was tremendously high, above all of our heads. There was no way of reaching it. Then I saw another 30-foot wave come our way. It grazed the bottom of the screen. I knew what had to be done. One of the theater-goers happened to be on a college swim team. She was the first one able to traverse one of the giant waves and climb into the screen. Once she was up there, she found a fire hose in the theater and reeled it out to us like a rope. One by one, we swam as hard as we could, praying to God we could reach the rope. Everyone's energy was sapped. Your body can only sustain itself on adrenaline and fear for so long. By some miracle, 5 of us got out. I was the last. I climbed the rope, coughing and vomiting. I had swallowed so much water that my stomach felt swollen. When I reached the top and they pulled me into the screen, I sobbed. I couldn't stop crying. My life had flashed countless times before my eyes. In bubbling, suffocating visions, I saw both my parents and my brother. I saw my high school graduation. I saw my favorite Christmas from when I was 6 years old. I had almost lost all of that. I had lost almost everything. On the dirty, carpeted theater floor, I lay with my face down, savoring the fact that I now lay on a hard surface. God bless ground. God bless this filthy, popcorn-strewn ground. Beside me I heard bantering, hugging, the wringing of wet clothes. Sylvester was the second last to be saved, and he was particularly vocal. Wah! He came and drummed me on the back, lifted me up. Oh my God, dude. Holy shit! I sat on my knees, wiping the tears and snot off my mouth. Sylvester clapped his hands, held his face and screamed some more. Holy shit, dude. That was so fucking scary. Like literally people were dying beside us. Like I saw people die. I nodded, shivering in my drenched clothes. I know it was... That was crazy! He laughed and stood up, patting everyone on the back. He kept clapping his hands like this was some sports event. That was sick. That was sick! He ruffled someone's hair, then ran up to me with an open palm. High five, dude. We made it! High five! Don't leave me hanging, dude. Story 9. The Little Night. It was early September of 1961, just a few miles out from the east shore of Lake Pontchartrain. We were on a noble quest, a knight's errand, as Bobby put it. He was always the smarter of us, the reader who liked to tell his baby brother scary stories in the dark, where heroes would face great evils. Sometimes they won, and sometimes they didn't. Bobby was my older brother by 5 years. He was all I had. We were forced to live with our uncle after our parents died in a house fire just 2 years before, and our lives had taken a turn. We'd always been poor, but living with our uncle was a new level of poverty and neglect that we had never known. I still got some rough spots on my arse end that built up underneath my uncle's switch. He was the opposite of our old man, and there wasn't even a lesser shadow of our perfect mother to take her place. There was only our uncle and his switch and his drink. As far back as I can remember, there were always stories of a witch who lived far beyond town out in the sticks. Stories of the swamp woman who would grant a wish and give you anything you wanted if you passed her awful test. Of course, no one ever did. Bobby heard them stories too. One late afternoon, we set out upon the swamp after our uncle had fallen deep under the spell of his whiskey. We rode our rusted old bicycles to the end of Louis Road and hoofed it the rest of the way through the cypress trees, up a winding path full of bugs and snakes and mud. It started pouring rain just before the shack came into view through the trees. It was a slapdash affair with mismatched mossy boards and a metal roof. We could hear the rain pounding down on it before it even came into view. It sat at the edge of a fetid bog. There were a couple of windows on the front of it with some of the panes missing. A couple of badly preserved hogsheads were on either side of the front door, just rotting and falling apart in that thick Louisiana air. A single rocking chair was on the porch. It was unlike anything else outside of, or within the shack. It was of a deep red wood, and it was polished to a high shine. It looked like something a queen would have been proud of to sit on. The one thing I remember that stuck out most were the stilts the shack sat on. Girthy timbers that held strong on the ground with several other pieces of wood splayed out on the bottoms. It looked like a bunch of chicken legs was holding it up. The rotten steps up to her porch gave under our muddy sneakers, and they groaned for mercy, crying out for help. Somewhere, out in the thick of that swamp, something answered that cry back. Me and Bobby froze. We had never heard an animal call like that before. We didn't know what it was, but it's still to this day the most awful, terrifying shriek I ever heard. Only the sound of a fire cracking in a pot-bellied stove snapped us back into the moment, and when we turned, she was standing in the doorway staring at us, a gnarled old woman with skin like shoe leather and the whitest teeth I'd ever seen. I took a step behind my big brother. She scared me. It went like this, just like the stories we heard. Bobby offered her his most cherished possession, and in return, she gave him the opportunity to take her test. If he won her game, he got his wish. If he lost, she kept his item, and something terrible would befall Bobby. Although we weren't sure at the time what that meant, all the stories we had heard left that terribleness up to the imagination. Come to find out, it was worse than I could have known. Bobby held out his Mickey Mouse doll he got the Christmas before I was born. My uncle made fun of him for keeping that thing, said he took it as evidence for him being queer, and beat him for it time and again. Bobby swore it still smelled like our old house. He would have taken 1,000 beatings before he gave that thing up. I watched him hand it over into the arthritic claws of that old witch. I watched her close those long nails around Mickey's face and almost cried. "How old are you?" "Boy." Her voice sounded broken, and her every breath was a tired wheeze. I strained to hear her over the driving rain on that metal roof. "I'm 14. Mom. You know, you face death if you fail, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am." My brother had no idea what those words meant, and neither did I. He was brave because he didn't realize what he was agreeing to. "What is it you want?" "I want my parents back. I can only do one miracle at a time." She smiled wide, and I noticed that one of her bottom teeth was missing, a tiny black hole in that otherwise perfect smile. "Pick one or the other." Bobby looked down at the floor, and then he looked back to me. I could read it in his face that he felt he'd be betraying one or the other. As for me, I would have picked my mama. I told Bobby that our daddy would be just fine in heaven by himself for a little longer, and that he would understand why we would pick mama over him. That seemed to make sense to Bobby, and he nodded at me before he turned back to the witch. "I want my mama back." That witch just smiled at Bobby, and then she ushered us into that nasty old shack. Books and books, moldy old books that reeked. Several cats were inside, and the smell of their piss made it hard to breathe. There were some shelves filled with odd knickknacks alongside one of the walls. A small family picture, a Bible, a baseball card, a fishing reel, all kinds of things. It was on one of these shelves that she placed Bobby's stuffed Mickey. There was a single door in the back of the shack, and she led us through it. Inside was only 3 things: a chair in the middle of the tiny room, and a small table sitting a few feet from it, with a cracked metronome sitting on top of it. There was no roof sitting on the 4 walls of this room. The rain was just pouring down inside. "Sit." I watched the floorboards bow under Bobby as he walked to the chair and sat down. The witch followed him. There were straps on the armrests and legs, just like in those pictures I had seen of electric chairs, and the witch tightened them on my brother after he sat down. "Watch this and only this." That old metronome started clicking under her touch. "What's going to happen?" "That's up to you. If your mind and your courage hold up, you'll get what you want. I suppose either way, you'll be seeing your mama real soon." She let out a terrible laugh as she pushed me out of the room and closed the door on my brother. I told him I loved him, and he said the same back to me. We walked out onto the porch, and she plopped down on that ornate rocking chair, lit up a pipe, and just stared at me while she rocked back and forth. All those cats sat around her. They were staring at me as well. It was almost dark. The rhythm of her rocking matched the clicking of that metronome that I could barely hear behind the closed door inside. The rain let up, and the fireflies were starting to come out. Her and those cats just stared at me. She was enjoying my fear. I started to ask her how long my brother would be in there, but she put her finger to her lips and told me to hush and listen. The sound of that metronome got louder, along with the groaning boards from the porch under the weight of her chair. I heard that awful animal out in the woods again, but this time it was answered by another call of the same, and then another, and another. The woods came alive with sounds that still give me nightmares. The sounds surrounded me in the dying light of that evening. That's when Bobby started to cry out. He was wailing in pain behind that old door, and I rushed inside to try and help him, while the old witch just sat in that chair and rocked. There was no lock on the door, but for some reason it just wouldn't open. I tried, and I begged God to help me and my brother. Bobby was screaming for help, but there was nothing I could do but cry. I ran back out onto the porch and begged the old woman to let my brother out of that room. She just smiled and puffed on that pipe. Then there was nothing but the sound of the metronome. The forest had gone quiet. Bobby had gone quiet. The fireflies were everywhere. The wind picked up, and the moss hanging from the trees started to dance against it. The old woman put down her pipe and took her time standing up. Then she walked back inside, and I followed. She opened the door. Bobby was still sitting in the chair with his eyes wide open, but he wasn't moving. He looked afraid. "He's with your mama now." I ran to Bobby, but she was right. He was gone. His skin was blue and he wasn't breathing. His eyes were full of tears and a thin trail of blood ran from his mouth. She pushed me out of the way and loosened the straps on the chair. I watched her heave my brother's lifeless body over her crooked shoulder. She walked out of the shack and off the porch. All I could do was follow. She walked over to the edge of the bog and heaved my brother into the muddy water. The shrieks from the forest returned, a greedy, hungry sound that I imagine came from hell itself. I watched Bobby slowly sink as she left me there on my knees at the bank. I was alone. After a good long sob, I walked back over to the trail we had walked in on. I looked back over my shoulder and saw the witch just rocking on her porch and smoking her pipe in the darkness. Her cats all perched on the rails of the porch with their glowing eyes fixed on me. I stared back down the trail and I thought about what my brother said. We were on a knight's errand. I slid my hand into my pocket and felt something I always carried with me. A small whistle that my daddy had carved from the cypress next to our old house. The only thing I had left. I knew I'd never see my parents again in this life. I accepted it, but I couldn't leave without my brother. I took out the whistle and put it to my lips, and I blew as hard as I could. The forest fell silent, as if the sound of that whistle scared away all the evil things out in the darkness. I walked back to the shack. The witch wasn't rocking anymore. I walked up the steps and I held my whistle forward. "How old are you?" "Boy." "I'm 9.
Mom.
You know, you face death if you fail, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am." I knew what those words meant. I knew full well what I was agreeing to. "What is it you want?" "I want my brother back." Bobby would tell me later that he saw our parents for just a moment before he came back to me. They were crying and told him that they were fine and they wished he had just moved on and lived a long life. That they were going to see him further down the road anyway. I suppose he's with them again. I lost him to a stroke last year. I rest easy at night, knowing that I'll see them all again someday, along with everyone else I've lost. Life is good and meant to be lived without looking back, because what comes after it will be, no matter what. Thank you for venturing into the darkness with us. If you dare to explore further, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more spine-tingling tales of horror and the supernatural. Remember, the shadows hold endless mysteries, waiting to be unveiled. Stay tuned for more bone-chilling stories as we continue to traverse the eerie depths of the unknown together. Until next time, may your dreams be free from the haunting echoes of our tales. Or perhaps not.